The man yelled loudly at the girl, threw her out of the house, and announced that he no longer considered her his daughter. These words broke the heart of the poor girl who truly longed for her father's attention and love. In this recap manhwa, a modern young woman was lying in her bed, eating fries and writing a novel. Aldehyde Countess of Seaton spread dirty rumors about sweet Sabrina. She was a wicked girl who committed all kinds of atrocities without cease. The villain's parents and the parents of the main character in the novel, and her fiancé were completely opposite, but that didn't justify her actions. Seaton's hawk was worried that the punishment for Adele's mischief would extend to the family, so he simply threw out his daughter, and shortly after the villain ended up starving to death alone on the street. At that moment, the girl decided to finish reading and first chose to lie down and sleep a little. It was supposed to be the only day she could rest, so the girl was looking forward to it. However, the next moment, she woke up in the middle of the room and didn't understand how she ended up here. A stranger stood in front of her and scolded her, and ordered her to leave his house. The heroine saw her blue hair, heard the name Adele, and immediately assumed she was in the body of the novel's villainess. She didn't understand how this happened, because just a couple of moments ago, she was lying in her bed. At that moment, Count Seaton ordered his bodyguards to throw the girl out of the house. The men immediately grabbed her by the arms and dragged her toward the exit, not giving Adele any chance to dodge. The girl was upset because she wasn't given the opportunity to fix everything. In her world, she was the owner and head chef of a Korean restaurant. Although Korean cuisine was quite complex, the heroine chose it gladly. She trusted her skills because she had been an excellent cook her whole life. The girl really enjoyed having her own restaurant and tirelessly practicing her culinary skills. That was until she got into her new body and found herself on the street. However, the girl didn't plan to give up, because if she was thrown out of the house, she'd somehow have to make ends meet. Fortunately for her, this world wasn't very different from hers, so the heroine devised a way to make money. It took her quite some time to find the right ingredients, but Adele started cooking. She decided to do what she loved, queue up and carve out a niche for street food. The street kids loved to cut out various shapes from their cookies. The boy wanted to get another free portion, but the girl grabbed him by the hand and surprised him by begging. However, they agreed that the boy would get more cookies if he brought new people. The boy didn't cheat by bringing his friends, so Adele launched the promotion. If a person could carve the figure exactly, they would receive a second cookie as a gift. Thanks to this, Adele, she was able to pay the rent and dreamed of opening her own restaurant in the future. One night, a girl with a cart was heading home. On the way, she accidentally dropped her utensils and tried to manage the situation because getting new ones was problematic. Adele looked at her earnings and realized that if she kept up the same spirit, she could soon start saving. At first, it was unusual, but the girl managed to adapt and little by little sold her jewelry to support the business. In fact, her jewelry and belongings weren't that important to her. She just wanted to cook. However, the girl was so happy that she completely forgot that along with success, problems always come. One night when the moon was full in the sky, some threatening guys approached her. Adele tried to justify herself, saying that she was nothing more than a small street vendor. However, they weren't fooled, and the girl resigned herself to her fate. She traveled in the carriage where they put her and thought about who could have kidnapped her. Adele didn't understand why anyone needed her. Since she was thrown out of the Count's house and the engagement was broken, the girl gave up. She decided that she would only discover the truth when she met with her boss. She could only hope that serious problems wouldn't arise. After a while, the kidnappers took the girl to a luxurious mansion where her boss met her. Adele was surprised that the man knew her life and background so well. However, he just laughed when the girl suggested that she needed a ransom from her parents. He didn't understand at all what other options there could be to profit from her kidnapping. However, after a moment, the man stepped out of the shadows and now his face was clearly visible. Beautiful features, dark hair, bright golden eyes. This marked him as Kyle Auburn in the original story. He was the second prince of the empire and the main villain of the novel. Adele was so scared that her whole body started to tremble. The girl involuntarily wrapped her arms around his neck. The man immediately noticed her strange reaction. He asked her why she was so afraid. However, Adele justified herself, saying she simply didn't expect to meet the prince in the middle of the night. At first, she thought he was just a rough gallant, but when his role was revealed, the fans went wild because it turned out he was the villain. The man took a moment to think, but then made a decision, after which the young man smiled and seemed like he posed no danger. Adele was surprised because the story described him as a reclusive and cold person. Meanwhile, Kyle got straight to the point and announced that he wanted to hire the girl as his personal chef. Adele was very surprised by this proposal since she hadn't expected it at all. Adele didn't understand why the prince needed a personal chef, so she reminded him that she was a vendor. The candy vendor girl didn't understand why she was chosen either, because she was the only one who knew how to cook the dalgona well. However, what intrigued the prince the most was the name of the dish the girl was preparing. So Adele said she had invented the most unique and interesting candy in the world. It seemed to her that due to her excitement, she was making too many mistakes because it was the first time she had met someone so important. The main character of the story was the crown prince, who had a younger brother acting as a secondary character. Being the second most noble person in the empire, the series of misfortunes began after the emperor died from an incurable illness. The prince was only kind to those women he loved. To everyone else, he was a ruthless tyrant. Having ascended to the throne, the prince incriminated his younger brother and expelled him from the empire. Everyone thought the second prince had simply disappeared, but Kyle became sad. And upon returning to the empire, he began committing all kinds of atrocities. First, he killed the main character's assistant. Then he started monitoring everything related to the main characters. The story portrayed him as a young and cruel master swordsman, which is why Adele decided that the smartest thing was to just hide. However, she failed because at that moment she was in front of the second prince and talking to him. The young man asked the girl to show him how to prepare her signature candy. Adele was very surprised by such a request, but followed the prince to the palace kitchen. The girl hadn't seen such spacious kitchens in a long time, so she was delighted. Everything seemed new, and the room itself was even larger than the kitchen of the hotel where she worked in her world. At that moment, the prince was nearby and observing the girl's actions and her work. Then Adele admitted that she felt uncomfortable cooking under the supervision of a stranger. Moreover, if someone discovers the secret of how to cook the dish, they will steal her business idea, so she would have to pay. However, the prince surprised our girl by telling her he wasn't interested in the recipe. He was only interested in what was in the kitchen to ensure the girl didn't poison the food. Kyle admitted he did not trust her. It's just that he doesn't trust anyone at all. However, if this is the girl's wish, he would gladly pay for the secret of how to prepare the dessert. The heroine immediately got inspired after these words because she had already imagined how quickly she would get rich. However, she also remembered that if she seemed too greedy, the prince might cut off her head. She had already made enough mistakes, so she only wanted to ask for covering her living expenses for a year. Adele asked for gold, but the prince without hesitation said he would give her 10 times more. After these words, our heroine literally went crazy with happiness. She appeared very excited and promised the prince to prepare the best desserts of her life. Adele immediately grabbed a ladle, wooden stick sugar baking soda, a food mill, and a mold, in the shape of a star. In fact, she would have brought even more utensils with her, but no one would have. Imagine she would have to cook in the imperial kitchen. The prince was surprised that the girl needed so few different elements to make sweets. That's why, to give it a new flavor, Adele suggested adding a bit of nutmeg and cinnamon. After this, the girl realized that the man hadn't even tasted her dessert because otherwise, he would have known it was just pure sugar, so she couldn't understand how the prince knew about her and what her purpose was. However, in any case, the girl considered herself a winner because with these sweets she could earn 10.000000. So she kept cooking as if she were going to make the best dessert of her life. Adele carefully heated the sugar in a ladle over the fire. She added baking soda, kneaded it, and then poured it into a baking tray. After that, the girl pressed the dough on top. Forming a circle, she cut a star in the center. After that, her sweetness was completely ready and could be served to the prince. The young man grabbed a cookie and simply broke it in half. Adele was a bit annoyed. Because she put in so much effort to make the star look beautiful, the cook saw the prince take a bite of her dessert and anxiously awaited his reaction. However, at that moment, the prince was only worried about whether the cookies were poisoned or not. The girl was upset because the man was watching the preparation and still didn't trust her. But what annoyed her the most was that he tasted her dessert and said absolutely nothing about the flavor. However, after this, the man immediately admitted that Adele wasn't preparing the dessert for him. Kyle walked down the dark hallway, followed by our heroine with a tray in her hands. The girl thought the situation was developing strangely because they were heading to an unknown place. After a while, they approached huge forged doors guarded by knights. From the conversation between the prince and the knights, the heroine realized that they had arrived at the emperor's chamber. Only then did she understand why the man was so cautious and checked that the dessert wasn't poisoned at that moment. Kyle was very angry because the knights wouldn't let him enter his father's chamber. So the men would have argued among themselves if they hadn't heard the voice of the emperor himself behind the doors. Only after his permission did the young men enter the bedroom. The gray-haired man was in his bed surrounded by attendants, and he asked why his son was coming to him in the middle of the night. Adele immediately noticed that the man was very thin. His arms gave him away. The girl even suggested that the emperor had already been defeated by an incurable disease, however, at that moment. The prince snatched the plate from her hands and handed the desserts to the emperor. The heroine noticed immediately the strange reaction of the empire's leader, who recognized the dessert with trembling hands. He took one of the cookies from the plate and brought it to his lips. Adele didn't understand why the ordinary sweetness caused so much emotion in the emperor. At one point, the man started eating cookies, but he coughed, and then his son and assistant immediately rushed to him. However, after a moment, a happy smile appeared on the emperor's face, and tears streamed down his eyes. It was revealed that Empress Celine, who was a minor character barely mentioned because she died at the beginning of the story, made the same desserts. The prince pointed out that this doesn't require any special ingredients, so you can enjoy the name at any time. The emperor immediately thanked his son for this gift and asked who prepared the dessert. Then Kyle introduced Adele, whom he presented as his personal chef. He explained that the girl sold these treats on the street and invented them herself. The emperor recalled that his beloved wife had told him the same when she was alive. That's why he asked the name of the street vendor who brought him. Good memories. The emperor was very surprised when he learned that the count's daughter had become the prince's cook. Adele realized that if things continued like this, she would have to meet her father. So the girl took everything into her own hands and announced that she had been expelled from the family, so she no longer obeyed anyone. She trembled with fear, realizing that now she dared to contradict the emperor himself. However, she only said that in this case, there were no problems. and the girl could continue working. The heroine didn't want to be called a villager, because in a story with that name, a sad fate awaited her after this. The emperor smiled and said he wanted to try the girl's other dishes. The servant tried to object, but the man noted that whoever managed to awaken his appetite deserved to be in the imperial kitchen. Adele was very surprised, and at the same time happy that everything had been resolved so quickly. She just hoped to be able to cook for the most important person in the country. Thus, she would obviously make a lot of money. Besides, the girl hadn't cooked her favorite dish in a long time, so she gladly accepted this offer in her dreams. Adele already saw herself stepping onto the stage and accepting congratulations as the best chef. She dreamed of being called the chef, responsible for the emperor's meals. It would be great to open her own restaurant and then present him with a good menu. However, the prince told the girl not to relax, because problems could arise in the future. He remembered that the emperor hadn't eaten anything for a whole month now. He only eats what the girl prepares, even if for now it was just sweets. It made him eat, so the problem was bigger, because after this, the girl would receive a lot of unwanted attention. At that moment, the young man noticed that Adele was preparing something new. The heroine explained that cookies are just a dessert and not a full meal. After a month of fasting, there should be severe weakness. So now the emperor needed light and healthy food. The prince noticed that the girl was worried about her father, so he felt a bit embarrassed about this. Adele hadn't cooked in a long time due to a lack of ingredients and didn't want to go overboard. She had to be careful, because the lord hadn't eaten in a long time. The emperor has dystrophy and says he has absolutely no appetite. During his illness, he only ate chicken broth, so now he needed simple meals. Adele is a Korean cook, so she almost never makes regular chicken soup. Then she decided to use a slightly different dish and show her trump card. After a while, the emperor sat down at the table and waited with pleasure to see what dish they would serve him for lunch. He lifted the lid of the tray and saw there was a bowl of homemade soup in front of him. The man immediately realized how much the cook was hoping for his approval. The prince noticed they were carefully checking all the food for poison. The servant was worried about his master, so he advised him not to eat too much soup, but to eat it slowly. However, after the first spoonful of homemade soup, the emperor was truly delighted. Adele was very happy to have hit the mark with his taste preferences. The man immediately noticed that there was something unusual in the soup that enhanced its flavor. Then the cook explained that it was authentic chestnut porridge. He added that it contains milk and rice similar to cream, but the flavor is much gentler. Adele explained that this porridge helps normalize digestion and sells tranquility. The prince immediately remembered how the girl reasoned while cooking in the kitchen. The emperor noticed that the flavor was unusual due to the addition of grated nuts, but he really liked it. The man admitted that it had been a long time since he experienced such emotions due to regular food. The prince was surprised to hear such words from his father, so he was impressed by the girl's work. The servant literally cried tears of joy when he saw that his master had finished his meal for the first time in a long time. At some point, the emperor admitted that he even wanted more and regretted having reached such a state. Adele decided to take advantage of the situation and noticed that the emperor had rejuvenated before her eyes. She announced that she would be happy to continue working and cooking for the emperor. From the reaction of the maid, the girl immediately realized that she had said something very absurd. She immediately apologized for her rudeness and blushed with embarrassment. However, the emperor just laughed and asked her son to take care of the girl who was arriving at their palace. She was very happy to have been officially hired, so she thanked the emperor from the bottom of her heart after that. The boys went out into the hallway, and the prince explained that they would give her a room. They would also send a messenger to collect the rest of her things. Kyle was surprised by how clearly the girl expressed her emotions and how well she performed her job. He had heard of Adele before because she was popular in society, but it turned out she was much more famous than he thought. The prince was thinking to himself. When one of the servants approached from behind and called him, he leaned towards Kyle's ear. He whispered some important report they had obtained. The count reacted faster than the prince expected, so now they had some difficulties. Adele braided her hair, put on her apron, and threw open the curtains. The girl was in a very good mood and enjoyed the beautiful weather outside the window. The prince watched what the girl was preparing. He couldn't understand how something tasty could come out of this. However, Adele reminded him again that if you want to know a secret, you have to pay for it. However, she replied that in ordinary life she doesn't throw money around. At that moment, she did so only because her father needed urgent help while she was cooking. Periodically, the girl explained what she was doing and what she was adding. This time she added ginger, which was very beneficial for health. The prince appreciated that the girl cared so much about her father's health. However, he noticed that the emperor rejected any medication due to the unpleasant smell and taste. That's why he worried that the girl would get upset if the emperor pushed away his plate. However, Adele just smiled and said that in that case she would eat his plate herself. She realized that some people say that food is the best medicine for the dish. She had to clean the chicken legs well and open the heads of garlic, then chop the onion. Add the ginger and throw it all into the broth to cook. While it cooks, you can start chopping the main ingredients. Every now and then you can approach the pot and taste the resulting broth. After this, you need to stuff the chicken with rice and chestnuts, then add it to the broth and cook again until the meat is done. After this, the dish can be served to the emperor and eaten at the same time as the sauce. The man was impressed with the presentation and didn't understand why in this recap manhwa he wanted to taste the dish as soon as possible. He immediately tasted a bit of the broth and felt the gentle aroma of the medicinal herbs. He immediately tasted a bit of the broth and felt the soft aroma of the medicinal herbs. That was not intrusive after this. The emperor carefully tore off the tender meat from the chicken that had been boiling for several hours. However, what surprised him most was that there was something hidden inside the chicken. The emperor carefully cut into the carcass and immediately rice and golden chestnuts fell out. The man couldn't believe that such a way of cooking rice that combined so many different flavors existed after this. The emperor immediately set the spoon aside and noticed that this was not chicken soup at all. At first, Adele was annoyed and started to fear that the man wouldn't like her dish. However, the emperor announced that he would now call this dish Imperial Chicken Soup. It was so good that it was several times better than regular chicken soup. The servant and the prince were stunned by this declaration, but Adele didn't understand what was so special. Then the servant explained that adding such an adjective is an incredible honor, and that the girl should thank the emperor. Adele herself did just that, but she actually felt embarrassed in front of the real author of this dish from her world. However, a second later, the girl was even more surprised, because the head of state named her head of imperial cuisine. The servant was horrified, because the chief had already been chosen, and it was impossible to put another person in such an important position. He remembered that the nobility would not recognize the girl, and all the other cooks would rebel. Therefore, the emperor decided to hold a banquet, and the main dish would be Adele's dish, after which she would be named the official chef. Then those who tasted her food would simply have to accept her new position. The servant understood that he couldn't oppose the emperor, so he accepted his decision. The next second, he cried tears of joy, which surprised Adele a lot. After that, they began discussing the budget and the date, and the prince called for the girl to come out. Adele left the emperor's quarters and headed to the kitchen accompanied by the prince. The first prince. The main character of the story already had some power. If the emperor dies according to the plot, the throne will automatically pass to his heirs. In the story, it went to Kyle's older brother, the first prince who exiled his brother. That's why the girl was worried about the secondary character she'd come to know better. However, he literally read her thoughts and noted that the girl had nothing to worry about. He explained that the purpose of the banquet was to show that the emperor was once again in his prime, so that no one would pay much attention to the cook. Adele was upset, because this meant her dishes were so terrible that no one would care. The prince realized he had said something wrong and hurried to calm our heroine. However, the girl was not upset. She understood that everyone around her still didn't realize how good she was at cooking with these words. The prince wounded her pride, so the girl challenged herself. She promised to show all her skills, and everyone would cry and beg her to cook something else. The most important rule when cooking soup was that the longer you cooked it, the better it would taste, which is why a true chef had to combine all the ingredients and then let the broth saturate it. Only after this could the soup be served at the table and offered for tasting. Adele understood that the prince wasn't deliberately ignoring her. He just didn't fully grasp her skill. That's why the girl hoped the young man would try her dish and be enchanted. Carl decided to follow the cook's example, so he carefully took the spoon and returned to the soup. Adele was delighted with how wonderfully I combined the meat and ginger and other ingredients. The girl was very happy because it had been a long time since she had the opportunity to cook those dishes, which is why she understood why the emperor decided to call this soup imperial. She thought she was cooking the most delicious food, so she couldn't stop. The girl hoped that the second prince had already eaten his portion and could give his opinion. However, then she realized that the young man hadn't even touched the soup on his plate. The cook assumed it was because he didn't eat ginger. But despite this, the emperor was delighted with his soup. However, he didn't elaborate on this topic and wanted to say something to the girl since she had already finished eating. He warned her that Count Citon had been acting strangely lately. Adele immediately realized that her father and family were plotting something against her. Carl remembered that the emperor's cook was in charge of preparing the banquet so they wouldn't take their eyes off the girl after his words. Adele assumed that the young man was worried about her. However, he felt very embarrassed and said that he was just warning her as a thank you for the delicious food. The cook noticed that the man hadn't even touched the soup he was served. Especially Kyle noticed his mistake and said he was about to try it. Adele was very worried because she wanted to see the prince's real reaction. The girl hoped he would start idolizing her skills and ask for more. However, instead Kyle seemed embarrassed to say he didn't like the food. The cook couldn't believe that the second prince had such a strange reaction to her soup. The young man kept trying to convince the girl that he enjoyed it, but he realized he was lying to her, so he simply took the food away. At some point, he decided that the prince was testing her in this way. The girl promised herself that next time she would make the young man beg for more on his knees. Then she made it clear to the prince that she had worked hard to prepare this dish. After this, Adele said she had no friends, and no one had visited her since she was kicked out of her home. Kyle apologized for this, which surprised the cook so much that she almost dropped the dishes from her hands. She explained that princes normally don't apologize to palace servants. However, he explained that he's not just any prince and knows what it's like to be alone. It seemed he wanted to say something more, but suddenly he regained his composure and fell silent. Adele realized that no one supported him in the imperial palace, and that he couldn't trust anyone, but at least he still had family to talk to. She only saw spoilers, so she really didn't understand why Kyle became a villain after that. The girl went to the library and checked out several books. Through this, she hoped to study popular recipes and select dishes that would be prepared for the banquet. The cook intended to make desserts that were popular throughout the empire. Kyle warned her to do everything right if she didn't want to waste time at some point. She even thought she had chosen the wrong hero's side. However, she attributed it all to the fact that she woke up early. And she was really hungry during that time. The girl dreamed of returning to her kitchen and eating butter clams. She enjoyed being the Imperial Chef a lot because she had all the ingredients at her disposal. Adele was walking down the hallway when suddenly someone called her from behind. The girl turned around and saw a tall boy with scarlet hair and green eyes in front of her. She didn't recognize him immediately, but couldn't believe they had met in a place like this. At first, Adele simply looked at her interlocutor and tried to remember who he could be from the novel. The girl assumed he was a friend of the prince, although he hadn't mentioned it before. At that moment, the young man started laughing at the cook for having such a silly job. Adele was angry because she was distracted from her clams for such a stupid reason. Immediately, another man joined her interlocutor, advising the boy not to talk to the girl so he wouldn't ruin his reputation. Only after this did Adele recognize the young man as the young Marquis of Granite, the fiancé of the real Adele. The man turned out to be very angry and noticed that the girl still didn't understand what was happening. He was furious that an exiled commoner dared to behave like that with the Marquis. The man pushed the girl so that all her books fell to the ground with a crash. However, instead of picking them up, the Marquis started stomping on them with his feet. Adele wanted to respond, but at that moment someone called her by name and stopped her. It turned out to be the second Prince Kyle who was walking through the Imperial Palace. The young man was interested in what was happening between the cook and the Marquis. He immediately stopped being angry and politely greeted the second prince. Adele fell to the ground and explained that she had been trying to find a cookbook in the library and was already heading to her room. However, what interested the prince the most was knowing why her books were on the hallway floor. He explained that the emperor personally ordered the preparation of the banquet and that the books were valuable materials. This behavior from the Marquis could mean he was challenging the imperial family. The prince wasn't going to tolerate the humiliation. To the emperor's personal chief, he explained that the Marquis was interfering with the work of those who served on behalf of his majesty. After that, he had no choice but to bow his head and apologize. Only after this did the prince calm down and order the young ones to leave and not bother the cook. He helped the girl with her books and hoped the situation wouldn't happen again. However, Adele quickly forgot all about it and invited Kyle to lunch with her, saying she just wanted to defend herself because the Marquis had insulted her. The prince explained that the young man was openly mocking the girl in front of strangers. However, he admitted it was a cruel but justifiable act. The girl was expelled from the house because she's a commoner, meaning she must respect the young Marquise. Adele completely forgot that in the world of the novel, a person's social status is very important. She promised to be more attentive to the people around her. However, the prince noticed that now she was under the emperor's patronage and could use his name as protection. The cook was so moved by this proposal that she wanted to feed the prince in gratitude. After this, the real preparations for the banquet began, where the girl had several assistants under her command and explained to everyone what their tasks were in the kitchen and supervised the completion of the work. Adele was a boss, so she knew how to competently direct the work of people in a team. Thanks to this, they quickly managed to make enough preparations for the upcoming banquet. The girl thought the cooks did an excellent job despite the dishes being unfamiliar to them, so in gratitude for their help, Adele decided to share some of her secrets with them to start. She amazed all the chefs with her special fig cutting. She was in the middle of her masterclass when one of the palace servants distracted her. The girl was busy preparing banquets, but Count Max wanted to see her right away. Thanks to the novel, the girl remembered that was the name of her ex-fiancé's trusted man. However, now she wasn't scared because Adele could use the prince's or the emperor's name as protection. Therefore, she asked to tell the count she was busy preparing the banquet and agreed to speak only personally with the man. The count was very angry because the girl ordered him to go see her himself if he had any business to discuss. In fact, the man was going to take revenge on his friend. The Marquis needed to come up with a plan again, so he turned his attention to the nearby girls. Max approached them and said he was a bit worried about the upcoming banquet. He shared that the head cook for tonight would be an ordinary commoner. By doing this, he hoped to discredit the girl and show everyone how terrible she was at cooking. One of the noble ladies was sure that the emperor would never trust such an important job to an incompetent cook. Then the count began to pressure about the fact that our heroine previously had a bad reputation. However, her interlocutor noticed that the young man was too rude to a girl of modest background. The man took his words into account and continued talking about the jokes that Adele made. He said the girl was a street vendor. She carried a dirty shop everywhere and sold sweets for a few coins. Since the girl was begging for coins, it meant that she was a real vagabond. Miss Charming didn't want to indulge the count's words, but in a way he was right. Later on the day of the banquet, rumors about the street cook reached the ears of the people. The count was proud to have made all these people talk about the girl behind her back. He even suggested that the food would be terrible and they should throw it away immediately. Even Madame Charming and her friend were a bit annoyed because they wanted to eat delicious food at the banquet. Finally, the servants began to set the table and prepared to serve the first course. Max was the first to approach the table. To take a closer look at this disgusting dish on his plate was a selection of various kinds of vegetables and fruits. He laughed a lot when the girl served him a very light dish of pickles with dried figs. The people around also weren't sure if it was appropriate to serve such a simple dish at a real imperial banquet. The count couldn't believe he would have to try such a dish, not to offend the emperor's honor. However, immediately after the first bite, he realized that it was not just simply a pickled cucumber. All the guests immediately noticed that the dish had notes of lemon and spices. The count didn't like that the people around him were delighted with the food, so he expected to open the forge. After the next bite, Then he immediately tried something that consisted of flour and crushed soy. However, Max's hopes were not fulfilled as he was enchanted by this dish. The banquet guests were delighted with the unusual texture of the familiar dish. We couldn't believe that a normally pickled cucumber could have such a fresh, crunchy, and soft taste at the same time. Even the Count agreed that a bite of this dish could awaken such a crazy appetite. After that, he couldn't resist and decided to try some dried figs, which had a wonderful sweet aroma that made people anticipate even more for the next dishes. Just at that moment, the servants brought out the main dish of the night, the Imperial chicken soup. The guests were amazed that the emperor himself had given his name to this dish. This only meant it was so good that it deserved to be called Imperial. Adele was very happy that the sovereign, she could eat her soup and never get tired of it. However, her favorite dessert at the banquet was the crispy and moist texture of the cream puff. The peach juice gave a unique sweetness and a seductive aroma, as if the fruit had just been picked from the branch. After this, the emperor was convinced that it was not in vain that he allowed the girl to organize this banquet and called his assistant. After this, the servant opened the specially brought box and showed the chef the emblem of the exclusive Imperial Chef, announcing that the chef responsible for organizing this banquet would receive a medal of honor. After this, the man addressed the audience and asked if anyone present had any objections. No one said a word. Only Lady Charming paid attention to Max. She noticed that the man was very hungry as he managed to eat everything. After so many condemnations, the Count felt very embarrassed by his behavior. He didn't have the courage to object, so it was accepted that there were no objections to the chef's remuneration. All the guests began to congratulate the new chef who received the distinction. Adele accepted the emblem and thanked the emperor for granting her such a great honor. After that, the girl returned to the kitchen, where she accepted the congratulations of her assistants. Everyone looked at her like a top-level culinary master and asked for advice. However, the idol shattered when the previous chef appeared in the kitchen. The man looked quite threatening and announced that he needed to say something urgently. Adele was sure the man was upset because she was using his kitchen and stealing his space. However, she then realized she was wrong, as the man began to ask her about various recipes with genuine interest. He explained that he was very proud of himself when he became the emperor's chef. However, the irreparable appetite and the constant pain of rejection led him to doubt himself. He praised Adele and asked her to give a small masterclass for the other chefs. The guys supported his proposal because everyone was curious. They asked her to tell them how the girl prepared the Imperial chicken soup. Adele accepted this proposal and promised they would learn something new from each other. After that, she went to the library and took out several books that the young chefs recommended. The girl believed that delicious food was truly the solution to all existing problems. She was very happy to be the Imperial chef. The girl was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't realize she almost stepped on a person who was already on the ground. Immediately after, she apologized and knelt down to help him up. It turned out to be a young man with glasses, who admitted he was just malnourished. Adele assumed he was a new employee because he looked very young. The boy tried to calm her and told her he didn't need food, explaining that this strange black stone, it's the main treasure of your life since you can eat it and be with it all day. Cooking the food requires a lot of effort, and cleaning up afterwards after cooking. An ordinary charcoal will save humanity from food slavery and will make us forget about food. The boy explained that he was going to make the pebble even smaller, and that this was just an intermediate result. He was very happy that thanks to his invention, the chef profession would disappear, after which the young man turned to Adele and asked her if she would like to participate in his experiment. The boy immediately noticed that the girl was carrying cookbooks, so she was a chef. Adele was annoyed that he knew her profession, but still talked about her plans after that. He introduced himself and was about to continue with his business. However, the name of the stranger made him stop and pay attention again. Elliot Horton never appeared in the novel, but his name was mentioned several times. An unbeatable alchemist who graduated from the Imperial Academy. At 16 years old and at 18 he received his own tower. Due to his extraordinary skills, the model began to worry that the man could complete his development. She couldn't allow all the chefs in this world to disappear because of some alchemist. That's why the girl decided to show the young man that the benefits of food are not just in being full. Elliot asked for a plate of eggs to be prepared, but he didn't understand the difference between the dishes. The man believed that any type of cooked egg was digested the same way, so it didn't make sense. However, Adele set out to prove to him that the most important thing in food is its flavor. Therefore, the girl whisked a bit of milk, eggs, and various seasonings, and threw them in the pot with the lid closed after a while. She carefully lifted the lid when the dish was cooked. The whisked eggs sealed in the container browned and rose. Even the young scientist was surprised that his favorite eggs could be prepared in such an unusual way. Adele explained that it's a steamed egg because the steam retains the flavor and sells the taste and excellent texture. She promised that if a man tried it, he would immediately understand what she was trying to convey. However, after the first bite in this recap, Manhwa Elliot set the spoon aside and said that this couldn't be called food. It seemed very serious. So Adele got really scared by his reaction. However, immediately after the inventor explained that it wasn't about food, but authentic alchemy. He had no idea that there was such a perfect balance when mixing egg, salt, and sugar. The soft texture and flavor of the hot omelet weren't boring and reminded him of the softest pudding. The man quickly ate the entire pot and hoped that next time the dish would be just as tasty. He knew it was a true masterpiece, because that flavor could only be created through precise calculations of proportions. Elliot was impressed with the work done, so he took Adele by the hand and asked her to teach him this alchemy. However, for now, he explained that what interested him the most was learning the basics, and Adele immediately realized it was better not to tell the guy that she added everything by eye. The girl was sure that the alchemist, wouldn't put wheels on the bike anymore since he was impressed by her cooking. However, at that very moment, she remembered that Elliot was the greatest genius of his time, so the girl hoped that together they could acquire modern kitchen utensils. Although she couldn't make him her student, she didn't want to lose contact with him. Therefore, she explained that she couldn't accept him as a student but offered to be partners. The girl thought to herself that this reminded her a lot of playing the lottery, where you initially don't know the outcome of events. Adele pretended to be interested in alchemy and would be delighted to collaborate with such a great scientist. Elliot was thrilled that the girl invited him to conduct research together. The boy realized he wasn't even participating in the research of his academy. Adele was just happy that the boy stopped developing the meal replacement product. The young man was so excited about the idea of doing research that he immediately ran to the tower. However, he didn't watch his feet, so he tripped over a bag of flour and fell to the ground. Because of this, clouds of dust appeared. Due to the flour being kicked up, the dust cleared a bit, and Adele saw that Elliot was really handsome without glasses. However, the boy was very embarrassed about his appearance, so he quickly rushed to find his glasses and covered his face with his hands. He asked the girl not to look at him. Adele couldn't let this happen, so she declared that the alchemist was the most handsome boy she had ever seen. The young man immediately put his glasses back on and asked the girl not to tease him anymore. He also apologized for ruining the ingredients and showing a scared face. Adele wanted to calm the situation, so she asked the young man to do her a favor for the sake of the research. However, this word immediately lifted the spirits of the young alchemist again. The cook said it would be fantastic to create a device that could control the intensity of the fire. The girl knew that with such a device, she could cook much spicier dishes. She could even try cooking baked chicken thighs or skewers. She was sure no one would refuse freshly prepared seafood, and regular Chinese food tastes much better when cooked over high heat. However, Elliot annoyed her and told her that only dragons can control fire. At first, Adele couldn't believe there were real dragons. She was surprised because dragons were never mentioned in the novel, and this world turned out to be much more dangerous. Almost at the same time, the servant smiled graciously and approached his master, throwing a dirty handkerchief at him. He said this was the most disgusting place he had ever been. After this, Count Seaton ordered that his daughter be brought to him, the heroine of the novel. He didn't realize she was a pawn of her parents, and didn't see her potential until the day he died. However, our modern girl and her body was the complete opposite. The girl immediately guessed that her father called her to a crowded place for some reason. The Count bowed his head and apologized. Adele understood that in the novel the heroine was weak and believed her father. She obeyed him in everything, and in such a situation she wouldn't have been able to defend herself. But our Adele was smart. She understood that here we had to act cunningly. The girl couldn't act too harshly because the people around her would consider her a villain again, so she came up with a sneaky plan to ask to be back with the family. Although she knew that a member of the Count's family couldn't work as the Emperor's cook, the girl was angry because her father wasn't going to bring her back, but wanted to use her as a cook. The man tried to justify himself by saying she would always be his daughter. Even though her name wasn't on the family tree, Adele knew he was the one responsible for all the problems in the true heroine's life. So she decided to take advantage of this opportunity, and the people watching around her, the girl announced loudly that she was very stupid, and realized her mistakes only after being kicked out of her house. She said she did all these terrible things and abused Lady. Sabrina, following her father's instructions, remembered well how the Count stood by her side and told her what to do. The man wasn't going to tolerate the girl publicly blaming her old father for this. However, Adele noticed there was poison in that wine causing a skin inflammation that she alone couldn't have contracted. The girl heard that, because of this Miss Sabrina, was completely isolated and wanted to apologize to her. Therefore, Adele suggested conducting a new investigation and discover who was really behind this. She announced that if the Count wanted to use her again for his own ends, she would no longer remain silent. Then the man promised he wouldn't bother the girl with his needs anymore. However, he warned her to be careful and not to talk so much. After that, the people around began to whisper even more actively because they saw such a fun fight. Adele couldn't believe the Count had just threatened her with the Emperor's death. No one knew how long the Emperor would be on her side and could protect her. Now, it wasn't the sick Emperor who was on the throne, but his eldest son, the Prince, that's why. The girl was sure that one day he would catch her and kill her as revenge for his beloved Sabrina. Therefore, the girl urgently needed to increase her influence to stop being afraid of the threat. She remembered that the second prince had offered her help and turned to him. She explained the situation and asked to be granted the title of knight. The girl did not go into details or say who exactly threatened her, however. She realized that she couldn't always count on the help of others and wanted to follow her own path. The prince said he couldn't grant such titles on his own. Otherwise, he would have done it a long time ago. The empire's law stated that the title of knight was awarded according to a very strict procedure, so that it wouldn't spread among the nobility. The title could only be given to those who had rendered outstanding service or made a contribution equal to that of the victorious general. Adele was upset because it would be difficult for her to earn the title and strengthen her position. She didn't know how she could avoid the problem now because relations among the nobility would worsen. However, Kyle thought for a long time and said they still had a small chance. But the young man didn't have time to say anything. as at that moment a servant burst into his room. It must be something very important if the man didn't even knock. First, the assistant was horrified and said that a royal dragon had appeared nearby. The prince immediately began to prepare for the journey, to confront the problem that had arisen. It was supposed to be the eldest prince who would do this, but the heir had gone on an expedition and was not expected to return soon. Upon hearing this, Kyle smiled maliciously and was glad his brother was gone. Adele didn't understand what was going on, but it seemed very important to her. The girl didn't even realize how she accepted to follow the prince in this. Even the servant couldn't believe that the prince would be accompanied by a cook on this dangerous journey after a while. The whole trio arrived at the meeting room at that moment. Representatives from different communities were already discussing there and discussing rumors about the appearance of a dragon. The prince slammed the door to draw attention to his arrival, reminding everyone present that they could not start debates in the absence of his excellence. Just after these words, the emperor appeared in the room and headed to a seat. He greeted everyone and announced they could take their seats. After this, the attendees sat down. Only Adele remained standing to the side. The prince noticed this, so he called the girl over to his side and offered her a chair. Even the emperor was surprised that his chef was present at this meeting. However, the prince distracted him from this thought and asked him to describe the situation on the battlefield. The land was plagued by natural disasters, so it was time to get rid of the dragon. A common soldier couldn't handle a dragon, so they suggested sending a message to a mercenary army. Adele listened carefully, and she realized that the novel didn't mention anything about the 3 famous dragon hunters, one of whom was over 70 years old, so they couldn't send him to the battlefield. The second hero was the countess, who was now in position, and she also couldn't go to battle. However, the girl noticed that only 2 heroes were being talked about, while there were actually 3. Only after this did the girl realize that the third hero was the strongest swordsman in the empire, capable of killing a dragon. Of course, turned out to be the lesser hero of the novel. The second prince, Kyle the Emperor, was incredibly proud of his youngest son and his incredible strength. Immediately after this, the people present began to honor the young man for being willing to protect them. However, before agreeing to this event, the prince announced that he had a request. The young man asked to be allowed to go with him to the chef. The nobles couldn't believe that someone on an expedition could need the strength of an ordinary cook, even the girl herself. Adele was shocked by this proposal and mentally lost it once the meeting was over. Adele and Kyle returned to their rooms. All this time, the girl had been silent, but the prince assumed that she really wanted to talk to him about something. Adele realized that her moment of glory had arrived, so she became seriously interested in him. She realized that the only knives she had were a kitchen knife, a vegetable peeler, and a Chinese knife. She added that among her combat skills, she only had 12 different ways to cut vegetables. And the girl ended up saying that it would be absolutely useless in battle. The prince was very surprised by this because initially, he had no intention of asking the girl for help. He explained that other people would kill the dragon, even though he was the only swordsman in the empire. The guy added that he just wanted to take the chef along. He remembered that the girl herself wanted to earn the title for special merits. Thanks to this, she could go down in history as Adele the Dragon Hunter. The prince seemed very calm and confident that they could win anyway. Then he asked the girl to simply sit in a safe place and that he would take care of the dragon himself. Adele was a little worried because it was obviously very difficult to kill a creature like that. However, hoping that the prince wasn't lying to her, this was a good opportunity to earn the title. That's why the girl gave in and accepted this trip. They agreed to leave at dawn the next day. However, Adele still didn't know how surprising this journey would turn out to be. She didn't expect such a result at all from the encounter with the formidable dragon. A whole day had already passed since the start of the journey, so the heroes decided to stop and set up a tent. It was very uncomfortable to be in the carriage, so Adele was glad when the prince helped her out onto the street. He explained that they managed to find a free corner. So what would happen at night in this place made Adele happy to finally focus on her business and prepare dinner. She explained that there was little space in the carriage, so she couldn't bring many ingredients, that she could only take the most important things, like a bag of white rice. And then she put various homemade seasonings in small containers and grabbed some dried anchovies to make broth and thought she would buy the rest of the products on the way in the towns while traveling. The girl smelled the scent of rhodiola root, which is used in Korean national cuisine. Adele wanted to create a spicy and sour mix and fry them until golden. The girl hoped the prince would like this dish, and if not, he would find food on his own after this. Adele went into the woods in search of the necessary plants, and the prince followed her. After a while, the scent grew stronger, so the girl realized she was almost there. From the outside, she looked like a hunting dog stalking its prey. Adele was right because just behind the neighboring bushes, she found the plant she needed. The girl was going to manually pull some roots from the ground, but the prince stopped her. Then Adele had to explain to him that she needed to get her hands dirty to prepare dinner. Moreover, the girl added that chefs often suffer while cooking. However, before she could speak, she immediately felt a strange energy surrounding her. The trees around started to shake. Adele even thought an earthquake had begun, and she closed her eyes in fear. She only opened them when everything around her calmed down. The girl looked and saw that a small trench had been dug in the middle of the forest. The prince noticed that he had only lightly used his technique with the sword. Adele thought it was worth it to save only the hands her character had in the original. However, the boy noticed that with his hands they prepared delicious dishes, so they are also worthy. At that moment, he took the girl's hand and looked directly into her eyes, which created a special atmosphere between them. After this, the prince began to collect roots, and Adele realized it was the first time someone said such nice things to her. After a while, the boys collected several trays with various roots and mushrooms for dinner. Adele was happy to be able to prepare not only fried roots, but also mushroom soup. After that, the boys returned to the camp and the girl began to prepare dinner. Adele admitted she didn't want to bother the prince with all sorts of little things and distract him. After all, she knew Kyle would need a lot of strength to defeat a real dragon. And for that, the prince committed to doing the best he could and trying to rest as much as possible. Before the important event, Adele knew that once the anchovy broth was ready, she would need to add mushrooms and a couple of ingredients. After this, the soup would be ready and she could move on to prepare the fried roots. You have to chop them well, add ground pepper, a bit of spicy paste, and at the end a special sauce. After this, everything had to be placed in a well-heated pan and fried for several minutes. While the roots are frying at that moment, the soup will infuse under the lid it needs. Very little time, so dinner will be ready in minutes. However, the girl didn't consider that the wonderful aroma of her food would spread throughout the wild forest. At that moment, the cook called all the other team members to dinner. After the first bite, Adele realized she had managed to prepare a dish that was truly delicious. The mild flavor of the cooked white rice perfectly combines with the spicy and roasted root of the plant, and the broth of green onions and mushrooms created a truly unique flavor. Even though she prepared everything herself, dinner was simply incredibly delicious. Even Kuchner noticed that he had never tasted dishes like this in his life before. Adele hoped that this time the prince would praise her food, but that didn't happen. She understood how he tasted this magnificent mushroom soup and still wasn't satisfied. The cook also knew that the locals found the fried roots quite spicy, but the prince was calm. However, he felt really discouraged when Kyle soon asked the girl not to cook anything for him anymore. The young man explained that he simply couldn't taste the flavor of various dishes. No matter what he ate, everything didn't seem very tasty to him, and that's how it had been his whole life. The cook immediately apologized for causing the prince so much trouble. He didn't understand why the boy didn't want to keep eating his food if he thought it was good. However, the prince explained that he was worried about forcing the girl to cook extra portions. But Adele took it as a challenge and promised to cook a meal so delicious that even the prince could appreciate it. Suddenly, Kyle's attention was drawn by some sounds coming from the direction of the forest. The young man immediately drew his sword and got ready to defend himself. However, instead of an enemy, a small red fox jumped out from the bushes and immediately headed for the pot of soup. And Adele realized it was attracted to the smell of the food. The prince was worried that a wild animal might attack him. But Adele was calm, poured the rest of the soup into a small plate, and carefully handed it directly to the little fox. The baby immediately tasted the food and perked up its ears in pleasure. After that, it turned around and started calling someone who was still sitting among the bushes. Immediately after this, several little foxes came running and joined him for lunch. Adele was delighted that even wild animals could appreciate her wonderful food. After a while, the little creatures finished off all the leftovers of the soup that the heroes didn't finish. They ran back to the forest, and Adele joked that now they were in Kyle's debt, admitting it was the first time in his life he had seen such strange fox pups. After that, the guys cleaned up and got in the carriage to move on. After a while, the driver abruptly stopped the cart, and out the window, Adele saw Destruction the Prince. He explained that it was a rather old dragon since it had incredible power. The land was dry, as if after a long drought, and it was clear that all living beings had long since died in the fire. Adele realized that the dragon could turn any prosperous land into a real hell in the blink of an eye. For quite some time, they had to drive through completely burned land. Suddenly, the prince announced he would go alone, and the rest of the village would wait. He reassured the girl and told her that if she did everything right, nothing would happen. He asked her not to worry and to wait for his return. In exchange, Adele asked the prince to come back safe and sound as soon as possible. Immediately after this, she approached the driver and asked for a favor. If the prince didn't return in 3 days, he should take the girl and quickly move to the capital. Adele reassured herself that so far everything was going according to plan, and that the prince had to survive. She hoped the boy could quickly solve the problem and return the hero. Realized that even if he managed to kill the dragon, restoring the land wouldn't be easy. Suddenly, in this recap manhwa, a strong wind blew and Kyle had to draw his sword to protect himself. Literally, in the blink of an eye, a dragon of incredible size appeared before the young man. The man immediately noticed it had a large body and blue eyes. Its entire body was covered with armor. Its wings reached incredible sizes, and the dazzling silver shine and blue light created a terrifying atmosphere around the dragon. Seeing such a creature, everyone instantly fell into a stupor, earning its name. Immediately, the prince realized that before him was the true king of all dragons. He was very surprised that the descendant of the old hero had come to kill him. Kyle immediately knelt down, set his sword aside, and apologized for attacking the king. After all, the Dragon King is the creature that bears the symbol of the imperial family. This is a symbol of power and strength, found in the origins of a 1,000-year-old empire. Its blood is like a river, and its body is like a mountain range. The life and prosperity of the nation depend on it. The prince realized that no matter what he did, they could never kill the dragon. If the Dragon King dies, the empire will lose power and begin to collapse, and eventually all the people would come to an end. The prince knew he would have to break his promises, since the dragon was angry and wanted to destroy the planet. Kyle mentally apologized to Adele, to whom he promised to return safe and sound. After that, he asked the dragon what he needed for the whole empire to unite to make his wish come true. However, the king noticed that he had lived a life too long, and now he was bored and wanted to die. The dragon asked the prince to kill him. In exchange, he promised to give him all his treasures with his funding. He could leave the Deadlands and establish his own empire. The prince was familiar with this cold look that reflected the desperation and exhaustion of the soul. The Dragon King seemed to have absolutely forgotten everything he once valued in this life. Just like the emperor began to wait for the day when his strength would be completely depleted. However, Kyle remembered that recently. His father was able to fall in love with life again and wanted to keep living. He realized that this was due to the food from his new cook Adele. Therefore, the young man got up from his knees and invited the Dragon King to try his personal chef's dish. The prince swore in his honor that the girl would cook something the dragon had never tasted in his life. He promised that if he tried her food, he would immediately want to live again, and the despair would disappear after all. The food from this girl intrigued even someone as picky as him. The dragon noticed that throughout his long life, he had tasted so many possible dishes among which there were delicacies nobody had ever heard of. Then the prince described the famous imperial chicken soup with a sour broth but very tender meat. He explained that the meat is well cooked so it can be easily separated from the bone. Also inside the chicken there are tender rice and chestnuts, and by mixing it with the broth a unique flavor is created. The prince described everything so vividly that the dragon thought he was exaggerating, even a little on the contrary. Kyle thought that his description didn't convey even half of the wonderful taste of the dish itself. Then he added that it was better for the dragon to try it himself, since his cook was nearby. However, the king was interested in who decided that the girl was the best cook. In the whole empire, he even suggested that the prince simply fell in love with her, which is why he exaggerates her skills. However, the prince opposed and said that his feelings had nothing to do with it. Adele was indeed the best cook in the country. The dragon admitted that the guy interested him, and that he was the only one who could kill him against his will. That's why he promised that he would definitely try the dish prepared by the best chef in the empire. However, if he wasn't impressed, then the prince would have to take responsibility and finish him. It has been quite a while since Kyle went to fight the dragon. 2 whole days passed before the coachman decided to tell the girl about their agreement. After a while, Adele noticed that the young prince was coming back and looked relatively healthy. She immediately ran towards him, and he started asking her about her well-being. However, the young man fell to his knees in front of the girl and began to beg for forgiveness. He admitted that he told the Dragon King about the girl and her cooking skills. Adele immediately assumed the dragon would want to eat her. However, the prince calmed her down and told her that the king was behaving the same way he did before the emperor. That's why he hoped the chef could give him a reason to live again. Kyle said the dragon agreed to try. Only the dish of the best chef in the empire, therefore. They will have to prove in some way that Adele is indeed a cook. That's why a cooking contest will soon be held in the empire for the title of the best out of embarrassment. The girl even covered her red face with her long hair. Kyle explained that if he could avoid disaster, it would improve his situation. He explained that he tried to recommend the girl, but the dragon still wanted to hold a contest. However, Adele was not worried at all. She trusted her skills and was even happy about the competition. In fact, the girl had many victories in various contests, culinary behind her, so she happily thanked the prince for this opportunity. The girl approached the young man and noticed she had to tell him something important. In fact, she just wanted to thank the young man for keeping his promise. The most important was that the prince returned safe and sound, although in a bit of an unusual way. Immediately after these words, Kyle felt a quickened heartbeat and was very embarrassed. The guys were about to get into the carriage when suddenly a strong earthquake started. The prince explained that this dragon returns the land to its original appearance. In fact, literally 1 second after this, the burned land began to turn green again, and the first flowers immediately appeared in the grass. Adele was surprised by the rapid change in the landscape around her. Just a couple of minutes ago, lifeless land stretched out. Only at that moment did the girl begin to worry that she would need a lot of strength to impress such a powerful creature. However, the prince assured her that the cook's food was unique, since even he could feel it. He asked the girl not to doubt herself. The dragon would never be disappointed with her food. After a while, Adele returned to her room and thought about the upcoming competition. She decided that above all, the dish had to be tasty enough to feed the dragon. Therefore, the girl felt a surge of strength and happily went to her kitchen to cook. Unfortunately, Elliot was right outside the door, whom the young man knocked down. He explained that he was standing outside the door because he wanted to tell the girl something. He took off his glasses, so Adele received a boost of energy upon seeing his handsome face. The young man explained that he wanted to show her his new invention, which looked like an ordinary sheet of paper. He explained that this is a product that will protect the cook from bad people. The young man, she whispered the secret of how to use it in the girl's ear. Because of this conversation, Adele had to run to avoid being late for the start of the competition. When she arrived at the designated place, a whole crowd of people had already gathered there. The girl barely managed to make her way through the spectators to the stage due to the large crowd of people. She accidentally tripped and bumped into the blonde who also wore a chef's uniform, which meant he was participating in the contest. Adele was glad there were so many beautiful young people around her among the participants. The most popular chefs in the empire were present at that moment. The only thing that calmed her was that the second prince was on the girl's side. His words made her believe more in herself and doubt her decisions less. The host announced that in the first round, the contestants would have all the necessary ingredients. At that moment, her servants lowered the curtain. and announced the theme of the first stage of the competition. Most of the contestants immediately held their heads and were worried. About not being able to cope, even Adele realized she had a pretty tough task ahead. From the start of the competition, the blonde girl she had met before also seemed very excited. Adele was absolutely delighted with the category of the contest, because it suited her perfectly. After this, the host announced that the competition had started, opened the doors, and showed the participants a huge hall equipped with chef tables. Adele was amazed at how impeccably clean and professional everything looked. The girl was happy that all the necessary ingredients were prepared for her dish. She provided me with a list of products, and after a while, I received everything I needed in the best way possible. The host added that all the judges expect honest evaluations from the Imperial Palace. The emperor has high expectations, so the girl must not disappoint him. She promised she would meet all expectations and would definitely win the contest. The servant was already used to the girl's behavior, so he just sighed calmly. However, he felt uncomfortable with the fact that the fate of the entire empire rested on the shoulders of such a fragile girl. Besides, among her rivals were quite famous chefs, however. The man still hoped everything would go well and smoothly. Adele had cooked quite a few amazing dishes for dinner, but had never made her own noodles before. The girl only knew in theory that it was necessary to mix starch with water and make sure to control the proportions. After that, you need to pour the mixture into a pan and simmer it, so nothing burns once everything is ready. It is necessary to cool and place the dough in cold water. After this, rinse well, cut very finely, and proceed with the rest of the ingredients first. It was necessary. Peel and finely chop the carrots, mushrooms, and onions, then carefully trim the meat and cut it into thin slices. The meat was coated with a marinade, special that even the picky Adele loved. Then the girl added spices and mixed well, after which the dish could be served. There were 15 minutes left in the competition when Adele started to prepare a small snack. The girl took a chef's knife and approached the unfortunate watermelon with an angry face. After a few minutes, all the other chefs also finished their dishes and began to serve them after the signal from the host announced that it was time to present their culinary masterpieces. After that, the doors opened and the judges entered and were able to give their scores. They assumed that among the cooks, there were newbies chasing the creation of a wonderful aroma and didn't take the taste into account at all. One of the judges was sure that all the chefs had to go through a strict selection process. He heard that some were admitted on the recommendation of the imperial family, but the identities of the participants were not revealed. This was done to ensure that all dishes were judged fairly and solely on their tastes. Some dishes looked so disgusting that they were a complete mockery of good ingredients. The judges had high expectations for the contest, but all the creative dishes were inedible, and the edible ones were not creative at all at that moment. It was our heroine's turn to evaluate the main dish. At first, the judges didn't pay much attention to its appearance, but they appreciated its taste. A little later, they noticed that the noodles shone and caught their attention. The head judge said that the dish maintained a pleasant texture, even when cold, and had the right balance of salt and sweetness. However, she felt disappointed when it was time to taste the dessert. The girl admitted that it wasn't even necessary to taste such a dessert, so she disqualified the participant. The results were summarized a little earlier, so the chefs were left waiting for the results to be announced. Adele didn't understand why everyone was taking it so seriously and worrying this competition. The girl heard among the crowd that a special reward would be given. For the victory, she didn't understand what it was about, but hoped it would be something different. After a while, the judge came out and said she was in charge of announcing the results of the first test. She immediately drew attention to the blue-haired girl about whom there were many rumors. Even during the test, many judges couldn't believe that Miss Greta wanted to eliminate the participant. They wondered what kind of dessert this participant had prepared that they didn't like so much. And the remaining judges lifted the dome and saw that it was several cubes of fruit and berries folded into the shape of a watermelon. The pieces of watermelon floating in the milk looked strange, but they could score points for creativity. Everyone was wondering why the chef decided to serve the dish on the watermelon when everyone had plates and spoons. One of the judges decided to try this dish. Although the others expressed their discontent, the young man was very surprised by the flavor of the dessert, which caught the attention of others. He thought it was just milk with fruit, but the flavor turned out to be unusual, like strong champagne. These words made the other judges believe in the dish and try it. The smooth flavor of the milk mixed with the sweetness of the sparkling water spread through my mouth. All the judges noticed that the milk paired well with the fruit. It would have been great if the dessert had been fresher. The last judge who hadn't tried the dishes wasn't happy with the teasing. That's why he wanted to quickly get this wonderful dessert into his mouth and enjoy its amazing flavor right after this. The man felt like he was on vacation somewhere riding on a river of watermelons. For this reason, 30 candidates were selected in the first round of the contest. Adele prayed mentally to make it to the finals. Miss Greta believed that the girl would succeed because she managed to surprise even her. This turned out to be true because Adele took first place among all participants. In the first round of the competition after this, the girl was asked to stand up. For the award ceremony, Adele felt very embarrassed that the prize was presented so formally. In front of other people, the girl went up on stage and bowed deeply in gratitude. After that, Miss Greta approached her and wanted to ask her some questions she was interested in, everything related to the method of preparing unusual noodles. The woman was also curious about how Adele came up with such an unusual dessert. The girl didn't know much about this world, but she had heard about a woman with golden hands who owns the largest restaurant in the entire empire. She's very strict with recruiting, making her the boss of the whole culinary world, where many try to get in. A surprising example is the dessert business that Adele sold on the streets of the city. That's why the girl decided to seize the opportunity and invited Miss Greta to talk later in private. Personal meetings during the competition were not allowed, so they agreed to chat. After the competition ended, another judge caught attention and announced that she would present a gift. The emperor's servant took out a box that supposedly contained a special prize. Adele didn't know what would be inside, but hoped for something unusual. However, to her surprise, it turned out to be a knife that looked completely normal. Great chefs had already begun to congratulate the girl on receiving such a relic, but Adele didn't understand the point after this. All the participants began to disperse to their respective companies, congratulating or comforting each other. Adele, she still couldn't understand what a wonderful prize they had given her, and what its value was at that moment. A stranger called the girl from behind, forcing her to turn around. It turned out to be the same man, the blonde guy Adele had encountered before. He seemed confident and was very handsome, which embarrassed our heroine. However, she got angry when he asked her how she managed to get first place. Adele thought the guy was implying that she had stolen his spot, so the girl noted that her victory was fair, and the spot didn't belong to just him. However, she didn't want to get mad at such a handsome guy, so she said she was a good cook. However, the guy was sure it was impossible to beat him. Bribing the judges was also impossible because Miss Greta is famous for her impartiality, so the blonde said that in the second round, he would definitely show what he was capable of. Only after that did the guy bother to introduce himself as Ferris. Mario, who got second place, turned out to be worried that the girl had received a scratched knife. His great-grandfather had a knife and called it a flat knife because no one used it to prepare exclusive dishes. The knife was later given away by family decision, so Mario hoped to recover it immediately after this. Adele decided to give the prize to the blonde who came in second place. However, the guy didn't want to accept it because the girl won with honest work, and he didn't deserve it. After that, he got embarrassed and admitted that he simply didn't believe anyone could beat him and take first place. So he wanted the girl to keep the knife, and still they could compete in the next stage. After this, the young man blushed terribly and started running in the opposite direction. Adele sighed deeply and realized that all the handsome men in this novel acted very strangely. After a while, the second stage of the contest for the title of Best Chef began. The theme was the same, but only ingredients that were found and assembled by the cooks themselves were allowed. Many were worried, but the judge said they would understand everything as soon as they saw the competition site. After that, the huge doors opened, and the cooks looked around in surprise. They realized that the second stage of the competition would take place outdoors. They were surrounded by rivers, forests, and numerous edible plants. The judge announced that a good cook would be able to create a wonderful dish under any condition. Some of the participants began to worry about not being able to complete the task on time. Afterwards, the judge showed the workspace and announced that the second stage of the competition had begun immediately after this. The cooks rushed to gather ingredients for their dishes. Meanwhile, Adele approached her station and inspected it carefully. Only after this did the girl go in search of ingredients, and was surprised by the space around her. She realized that Elliot had clearly created this place using his alchemy. The girl listened to the reasoning of the other cooks. They found it quite difficult to find other ingredients. They were sure it was impossible to find real meat or poultry in this space. These words led our heroine to have a great idea that she wanted to make a reality after this. The girl headed to the river and started fishing for its various inhabitants. After a while, she managed to collect a whole basket of octopuses and shrimp. This activity required a lot of energy, so Adele soon returned to her workstation. There, she realized that Mario was standing not far from her and was also about to cook something. Both felt uncomfortable being next to a guy who considered the other his enemy. Adele was cutting seafood, while Mario was busy with the boiling broth. The boy was missing something, so he took the bag and went back to look for food. Adele continued with her tasks when she saw that the boy had left the bubbling pot unattended. Before she had time to think of anything, she saw that one of the cooks had approached someone else's house. The man silently took out the bag and poured something into the soup. Adele had no time to do anything because everything happened very quickly and unexpectedly. Immediately after this, she called the cook, who got scared and tried to run away but couldn't because the guards caught him almost immediately. At that moment, Mario returned to his workstation and saw the broth ruined. The boy realized that the dish could no longer be salvaged, so he was very upset and depressed. Miss Greta was very angry because one cook prevented another from preparing his dish. The boy admitted that he didn't want to leave the competition alone, so he decided to drag the famous chef with him. Miss Greta couldn't believe that the man from this kitchen would allow such a thing, so she ripped off the chef's ban and told him that in the future, the way to the kitchen would be closed for him. The judge apologized to the other participants for the incident. There was still time, so Mario thought about whether he should prepare something else to replace it. Adele approached the boy and offered to lend him some vegetables she no longer needed. However, the cook refused, and the girl reminded him that they needed to be able to work together. She admitted that she didn't want anything in return. She just thought it wouldn't be fair to lose this way. Mario felt very embarrassed by the girl's frank words and still accepted her proposal. Adele gave him garlic scallions and other vegetables that the boy needed. He was very embarrassed for having taken advantage. Thanked the girl for her help, but had a lot of fun watching how the young man knows how to show the sincerity of his intentions when necessary right after. He went back to cooking and started cutting the shrimp. The girl only had to add the secret ingredient. But after what happened, she was scared to leave her plate alone after what happened. It's unlikely anyone would decide to ruin it again, but you couldn't trust anyone. That's why Adele decided to leave a remedy that could help her if something happened. In this recap, Manhwa Elliot explained that with the help of this small piece of paper, the girl could track a person's location. Then Adele stuck it to the lid of the pan. On the back of the handle, she didn't want to resort to this. But given the problem she faced, it was necessary to improve security. After that, the girl quietly went about her business looking for the necessary ingredient as soon as she left. One of the cooks immediately approached the pan and started looking at it all over. However, the guards were nearby and closely monitored all the participants meanwhile in the palace. Prince Kyle was listening to the maid's complaints about his particularly important guest. He didn't like the elephant crest. And for that reason, he simply threw it out the window. He also broke the vase, saying he didn't like the look of the rose. The prince understood perfectly that nothing could be done about the dragon's character, so he asked to be friendly. He thought the dragon was doing this on purpose to force the prince to keep his promise. It seemed like he was deliberately provoking Kyle to kill him while walking through the palace. The prince overheard a conversation among several young nobles. From what he heard, he realized that the guys were betting on the winner of the cooking contest. The prince wanted to leave, but the amounts being announced surprised him a lot. One of the participants in the dispute was willing to spend a large amount of money on a joke. From their conversation, it was clear that the guy was hiding something and not saying anything. The boys were surprised, because their favorite in the first round only got third place. Max pretended like there was nothing wrong with this, and that this was just the first stage of the competition. However, the young man remembered not to be too confident when there's such a large amount of money at stake. However, this didn't stop. The young man still decided to place a bet. The prince immediately thought this seemed very suspicious, especially considering Max's confidence in his victory. She immediately thought that this seemed very suspicious, especially considering Max's confidence in his victory. Meanwhile, in the competition, Adele returned to her workstation. She still had a bit of free time, so she decided to buy some fresh vegetables on the way to stock up. Adele was even surprised that the competition was so easy and smooth for her. However, all her joy vanished as soon as the girl returned to her pan. She saw that someone had thrown the entire dish on the ground and it spilled. Adele was so upset that she fell to her knees and held her head. She immediately realized that someone had done it on purpose. Because the magic sticker was no longer on the handle, the girl didn't understand how none of the other diners could notice such an incident. Around this time, Mario returned to his table with new ingredients. He looked stunned and was very surprised that someone dared to ruin another person's dish again after the previous incident. Adele felt relieved that it wasn't Mario, but there were still big problems this time. They didn't know who the culprit was, so they couldn't count on the judge's help. There was only one option left that could still save the whole situation. Adele announced that she would never give up and that she would prepare the dish again. The girl pretended to keep calm and went back to fishing for sea reptiles. However, internally she was very worried about not being able to handle this competition. She was so worried that her hands wouldn't obey her, and the girl couldn't catch a single shrimp. Suddenly, something jumped out from the bushes and fell into the water right in front of the girl. She was very surprised when she saw that it was a little fox. The animal joyfully ran around the girl and enjoyed what was happening. Adele immediately realized that it was the same fox she had fed during the trip. However, she didn't understand how the fox that was so far away ended up in the Imperial Palace. The next moment, the animal was nowhere to be seen, so Adele even assumed it was her imagination. However, the little fox immediately came out of the water and startled our girl terribly. Between its teeth, it held a shrimp that it had just caught in the water. The boy approached the girl and carefully placed the shrimp directly in her basket. After this, the stage of searching for the remaining ingredients needed for the soup began. The little fox ran all over the beach and found small shrimp and octopuses. Adele didn't understand how the animal got here and realized that she needed shrimp and octopus before she had time to finish. The little fox got very angry and started growling at the bushes. The girl was afraid that someone was behind her and could interfere with her again. However, it turned out to be Mario, who was also in this part of the place, and came to the girl's voice. He saw that she was holding a basket full of various seafood ingredients. Adele noticed that the young man was very wet and was hiding something behind his back. However, she didn't pay attention to him and returned to her workstation in time to prepare the soup just after she left. Mario pulled out his basket from behind his back and thought his efforts were in vain because in his hands he had a bunch of fresh shrimp that the young guy had just caught. However, he decided to share his catch with the girl and took it directly to her table. Adele noticed that Mario wasn't cooking anything with the shrimp and didn't understand why he needed them. She realized the young guy was roasting a huge leg on a grill that she hadn't seen in the woods. Adele happily thanked her new friend for his help in preparing the food. However, the little fox still didn't react well to the young guy and got angry. A mutual aversion had developed between the boy and the animal. However, Adele calmed them both down by saying that they had both provided her with great help and support. After that, Mario returned to his work area, and the girl began to cook. She thought she could still prepare the secret dish on time. First, the girl started cleaning all the seafood ingredients again and cutting them to the required sizes. Ideally, she would add soy sauce, but it wasn't available in this world. Instead, the girl decided to make the dish very spicy, adding an unexpected element. The little fox was interested in smelling the sauce, but the smell was very strong. Adele secretly told me that it was a fish sauce with a very strong aroma made from fish, caught in nearby water bodies. If you create the perfect combination, the soy sauce will be replaced by an unforgettable salty aftertaste. Adele knew that the people here didn't like spicy food much, but she had little time to work on the sauce. Just then, the judge announced that there were 10 minutes left in the competition, so the girl decided to take a risk and pour all the sauce she managed to make. Once the competition was over, the judges entered the hall to taste the dishes. The ravioli with finely chopped scallops were delicious, but it was a very common dish. The lightly fried chicken gizzards with sauce were tasty, but looked disgusting. Ms. Greta wanted to give everyone extra points for using only the ingredients they had on hand. After this, the girl noticed that one of the contestants had prepared a very familiar dish. The noodles and vegetables with meat came out from under the chef's knife, who last time placed third. All the judges were suspicious of this dish because it was very similar to the previous ones. However, upon closer inspection, it turned out that it wasn't a repeat of Adele's dish, but simply spicy noodles with a different presentation. Although it looked similar, it was a completely different dish. Ms. Greta was furious because the contestant dared to copy someone else's idea. The other judges were also sure that this dish was not prepared at all by his own efforts, so they disqualified the participant. Beneath the next stage awaited an unusual dish that looked like a huge piece of juicy meat. Even the judges were surprised that one of the participants managed to get such a big ham. However, after the cut, everyone was amazed at how the chef came up with such an interesting solution. Adele's dish was the last one left, so everyone was excited. However, when they lifted the lid, all the judges were scared of what was inside the pan. One of the young men decided to smell the dish and understand what it consisted of, and just the smell made him feel very sharp. His eyes were watering and he struggled to breathe. The other judges were even afraid to taste this dish because of its appearance. Miss Greta commented that Adele deserved for them to try her dishes before being judged by their appearance. After a while, all the participants gathered, again in a large hall, and waited for the announcement of the results. Adele couldn't find the little fox, so she asked the guards for help. However, they said they hadn't seen any animal and that they would definitely let us know if they found it. Just at that moment, the judges came out and began to announce the results of the competition. Miss Greta couldn't look the girl in the eyes, so she turned away. Adele immediately felt that something was wrong, because this is usually an indicator that a person is hiding something. Miss Greta announced that Mario took first place in the second stage of the contest. Adele always won contests and was the queen of awards. However, in this world, all achievements meant nothing, and the girl thought that for the first time she was experiencing defeat. She began to look for the reason and decided that it was because she had too little time to redo the dish. However, Mario was in the same position, but still managed to cook the dish and take first place, so it was all fair. Adele looked at her opponent and saw that he looked very down. However, she had no time to think about anything, because the judge announced that there would be 2 winners. Absolutely all the contestants were very surprised by what happened, and began to whisper among themselves. Everyone started to get indignant, but the judges reached this decision. After a long discussion, they explained that Mario's huge ham immediately caught the critics' attention. All the judges were very interested to know where the young man got that piece of meat, so they decided to look inside and saw that it was actually a watermelon. At first glance, it seems that the cut looks like a juicy steak, but in reality, it is not in terms of originality. The boy had no equal, and the taste was chosen perfectly. Really. The story has never seen a dish like this, and it deserved to win. However, there was a second chef, whose dish was very controversial and spicy. Its appearance was so terrible that many were even afraid to try it, and after the first bite, they went crazy from how spicy it was. However, the judges agreed that they had never tasted such a dish, so the girl met the conditions of the fight. The dish was too spicy, to the point that it was hard to discern the actual flavor of the ingredients. However, the more you get used to the spicy flavor, the better the taste feels, and over time, interesting notes begin to reveal themselves. The dish had a spicy, but at the same time mild flavor, and was surprisingly good. Moreover, it left a unique impression that was impossible to shake off. The judges noticed that the more you eat, the more interesting the flavor is, even if it's painful. Therefore, they could not overlook the girl and choose only one winner. Mario's dish had a great idea and great flavor, but the texture of some of the ingredients disappointed Adele, surprised with the originality and combination of ingredients. But the proportions were off. However, both dishes didn't get ruined too much and still remained excellent. And that's why the judges invited the other participants to decide for themselves if it was worth awarding both winners at the same time. Everyone agreed on this. But there was still one last competition left, and the final evaluation from a special guest. The judges announced that in the end, only one single winner would be chosen. However, this would be decided by the same secret guest who would taste both dishes. The competition's venue is at the specially designated room in the Imperial Palace. Adele immediately assumed that it would be there where the final decision would be made. The girl also supposed that the last judge and the secret guest would be the dragon itself. The heroine entered the competition room and saw that Mario was already there. She wondered why the young guy was so happy to see the girl after what happened last time. She thought he considered her his main rival. However, she downplayed her intensity, reminding him that there were 2 winners in the last round. The girl didn't want to fight, so she invited the young guy to wish each other good luck. A meeting with the dragon could change their whole lives. Adele couldn't waste her nerves like that. However, Mario didn't know all this. He was just embarrassed by how beautiful the girl was. After a while, both participants presented themselves to the judges, who had to announce the start of the competition. Just before the start, Adele suggested that the guy not focus on the scores and just give it his all to prepare a wonderful dish. It turned out that in the final stage, it would be necessary to completely repeat the dishes that the heroes prepared in the previous round. For this, they were provided with all the necessary ingredients and were not limited by time. Mario was also glad that this time he wouldn't have any problems related to a lack of ingredients or time. When cooking meat, it's necessary to pay close attention to controlling the fire to make the conditions comfortable for him. In any case, the girl tried not to keep the final judge waiting too long immediately. She sent someone to get the ingredients and noticed that the emperor prawns were of much better quality than the ones she had caught in the last round. She didn't even have enough time to choose the ingredients. So here the girl felt a bit of freedom. Mario also decided to give it his all and was already preparing the watermelon steak. According to the judge's reaction last time, Adele thought there was a big problem with her dish. She made it too spicy. So next time it would be necessary to adjust the amount of seasoning. After a while, both chefs had finished their dishes and were ready to serve them. The guys brought them over and placed them in front of the judges. The maid thanked the cooks for their work and asked them to wait a bit for the results. Adele was surprised at how a dragon king so big could fit in the Imperial Palace. Before the girl had time to look back, the door suddenly opened and a gust of wind blew over them. Mario helped Adele stay on her feet and endure the sudden wind. A couple of moments later, a stunningly handsome tall young man with long hair stepped out through the doors that had opened. Immediately after this, Mario and Adele stepped away to avoid creating an awkward situation for the judge. He was annoyed that he was told he would try a dish from a great chef and was angry because people couldn't even choose a single winner. Adele realized that even though he had a human form, he was still a dragon. The man couldn't decide whether to evaluate the dish or just burn everything. However, he paid attention to the plate that was provided for him to taste. He didn't like that there were two cooks, but the dragon still decided to try their dish. Adele noticed that Mario noticed something strange and got scared about it. The girl decided to step forward and thank the special guest for his understanding. First of all, the judge focused his attention specifically on Mario's watermelon steak. The young man invited the guest to try his dish himself and determine what it was made of, but Adele already knew it was watermelon. And still it seemed to him that it was fried meat. The judge was very surprised after the first bite and immediately wanted to try this dish again. While he was busy eating watermelon, Mario suggested that the girl escape. She was very surprised by this proposal, so she asked why it had occurred to Mario. The boy explained that what was in front of them was not an ordinary person, but a great being. However, he suggested that this was a real vampire that fed on blood. Previously, he thought it was just some kind of fairy tale, but vampires really existed. It was rumored that the Imperial Palace was inhabited by monsters that drank human blood. I remembered the girl's words before the finals and assumed that Adele knew everything. However, the girl stood up and explained that it wasn't a vampire, but a true ancient dragon king. The king listened to them, but he liked the watermelon. So he decided to ignore Mario's words. The cook realized that he had offended the great being, so he got scared and apologized. After this, the dragon began to take a sample of Adele's dish. He tasted the first spoonful, and immediately a whole cloud of fire appeared around him. In a moment, the heat became so intense that the cooks got scared. This was the first time they had seen a dragon capable of spitting fire all over its body. In fact, the king was delighted that people could cook such spicy dishes. The cheese softens the unusual spicy flavor of the dish that normally a person couldn't tolerate the sweetness, the salt, and the heat. They were in the right places, and the dish itself had an incredible texture right after this. The dragon announced that he had made his final decision on the winner and asked Mario not to get mad, because he liked Adele's dish a little more. The young man accepted this defeat honorably and behaved with dignity. Adele was a bit embarrassed that the dragon could so easily determine the winner the next second. The girl was surrounded by the great dragon king's fire. Mario feared for his friend, but she was doing just fine. The dragon believed that talented people should be rewarded for their skills. Therefore, Adele would no longer fear fire, and all the dragon's descendants would honor her as well. The dragon added that the girl had already met one of them and would soon understand everything for herself. After that, he used his summoning power and a small cloud of fire appeared under the ceiling. A second later, from there, a small fox fell that had been helping the girl all this time. The little fox immediately jumped into the girl's arms and started licking her face. The king said that the little dragon is only 900 years old, but is quite capable. He was a smart kid who understood everything perfectly, and there were normally no problems communicating with him. Adele immediately realized at their first meeting that he wasn't an ordinary fox, so she was happy to learn the truth. The dragon explained that he had no name because he was the only fire spirit of the Starlight family. Therefore, besides the main prize, Adele also had the honor of naming the little fox Mars after returning from the competition. The prince met the girl and immediately congratulated her on her victory. However, he said that unfortunately the girl would not receive the title. Now she would become the dragon chef, but would still hold the status of a commoner. Adele was sure she would gain power after the competition, but everything changed. Suddenly, the prince explained that it all happened thanks to his father. Earl Seton firmly opposed the title session and unleashed the rumor that he was going to send the girl back to the family. Adele and the prince understood perfectly that this was a lie, but the final decision was made by the emperor. He realized that if he gave the girl a title, her father could no longer accept her back into the family. Even if he could, he wouldn't just take that opportunity away. He couldn't take away the girl's chance to reunite with her family, so the prince had to accept his decision. He knew he was powerless in such a situation, so he apologized to the girl at that moment. Adele remembered the dragon's request to convey his words to the prince. The king mentioned that the young had won his bet and would receive a reward. Although the dragon lost, he was still happy because he tasted an incredible dish. That's why Adele decided to trust the prince and noticed he had already tried hard enough to treat the girl with respect. Kyle. He's the only person in the palace who can be on her side. So Adele thanked him. The young man sincerely believed the girl deserved her reward and title, which made him worried. He wanted to gently pet her head and calm her down, but he was attacked by a fox. Adele immediately apologized for Mars's behavior in front of the second prince of the empire. After that, he asked the baby not to bite anyone else. Otherwise, they'd have problems. The prince immediately recognized that it was the same beast in the same forest they had recently encountered. The girl hoped that Mars would think about his behavior and apologize to the prince. However, the spirit refused to do this, made a face, and walked away. In this case, Adele decided to make it up to the young man in another way. She offered to follow him and try a wonderful dish she would prepare especially for him. Thanks to her skills, the little one, Fox, was able to give the girl the right amount of fire. Adele was happy to be able to cook different types of dishes that she hadn't been able to make before. The girl told the prince that she was going to prepare bamboo shoots. She was also going to add tree mushrooms that only look poisonous. She wondered where the prince got such interest in her work after all. He used to say he wasn't particularly interested in all these recipes. Adele hoped that it would be her dishes that had such an effect on him. The prince was surprised at how much the girl liked cooking. She healed the emperor and even managed to surprise the great dragon king. After a while, the dish was ready and the buttery aroma blended perfectly with the smell of the sauce. However, before tasting the dish, Adele wanted to introduce it. The girl explained that the warm sauce harmonizes perfectly with the meat, and the flavor evolves with each new bite. In fact, she cooked pork and sweet and sour sauce for the second prince. A unique combination is created by adding sweet and sour sauce to hot meat. Thanks to frying, it stays crispy, and the onions, mushrooms, and crispy bamboo shoots give it an incredible aroma. The dish was so delicious that even the little fox asked for more. That's why Adele hoped this time the prince would really like her dish. After a while, the girl noticed that the young man left an empty plate for the first time, admitting it was very tasty. But he pointed out that the dish was too salty for him. He described it as a great mix of sour and sweet, and the meat was very juicy. Adele. She was surprised that the prince described the flavor in such detail, because last time he said he couldn't taste it. Then the prince explained that any flavor seems normal to him if the dish isn't delicious. The girl immediately guessed that the young man could become a true gourmet. She explained that people who are born with such sensitivity to taste need very delicate food, so he can only eat what he really likes. In fact, the young man just hasn't found a dish that he truly likes yet, which is why Adele explained that the food prepared exactly according to the prince's preferences would be the most delicious. Before the girl could finish speaking, Elliot burst into the room and congratulated her on her victory. The prince was surprised that the great alchemist entered the girl's office so easily. In fact, he had very important news to tell Adele. He finally discovered who exactly ruined the food. On the day of the second competition, the prince didn't want to ruin the mood, but he had to do it. The young man stepped forward and said that he also wanted to know what was going on. Only then did Elliot realize it was Kyle and immediately bowed to him as a greeting. Adele noticed there was a strange hostility and tension between the young men. She thought he had decided to keep the location of the competition a secret. Then she pretended to forget that she had an appointment with the alchemist. Then the girl called Mars, who had just finished eating his portion. She told the prince that he was interested in the girl's cooking skills, so sometimes she helps him. Kyle wanted to see the research, but the alchemist replied that it was problematic. He explained that the crown prince and Kyle's older brother were behind his research, so if he wanted to see his research, he would first need to get the prince's permission. Immediately after these words, Kyle got very angry and considered this a great insolence. Adele forgot that Elliot was on the heir's side and dragged him into this conversation in vain. The girl was trembling with fear, and the little fox was upset about Adele's state. Kyle noticed this, so he apologized for his behavior and promised to find something he liked. After that, the girl said goodbye to the prince and followed Elliot to his lab. The young alchemist said he wanted to show her his latest invention. Adele was very impressed with the room where Elliot conducted his research. However, he actually wanted to show her another invention he called Assistant. The young man asked the girl to look. A little blue ball explained that this can be set up in advance and will record any voice, and then the sound can be played back using a special machine. The alchemist lowered the ball to the structure of many pipes and immediately turned on the setup after that. A voice came from behind the cars that sounded familiar to the girl. Miss Greta said there would be only one winner in the final. Suddenly the news was heard that someone had paid specifically to ruin Adele's dish. However, despite this, both Mario's and Adele's dishes turned out to be winners in the end. The girl recognized Max's voice, who said he had bet 10.0000000 that they would lose. She assumed the guy had bet an impressive amount on Alfred's victory. That's why he wanted to interfere with the others, and especially with the contenders for victory. However, now he had lost all his money and had to pay the debt. Now someone was blackmailing him, telling him they would inform if Count Max didn't return the money. However, he didn't even have half that amount. So the guy was worried. He promised he would definitely receive this money or pay. In another way, he was angry because his plan was completely recorded in the machine. Thanks to the conversation, he learned that one of the guards was talking to Max. It was him who ruined the dish. But the rest of the incidents were not confirmed. Because of this, Elliot was reluctant to forgive the guard for his dirty tricks. The young man hoped Adele would reveal the trick and use the evidence from her car, however. The girl didn't intend to do this and didn't plan to talk about it with anyone at all. She promised she wouldn't tell anyone and asked Elliot to do the same. She said it was better not to reveal to anyone. Yet the secret of her invention. The boy admitted he doesn't always report on his inventions. He only talks about the most important ones. That's why he assumed Adele didn't want everyone to know who helped her. The girl admitted he shouldn't have invented such a machine at all. She was upset because this handsome man tried so hard to help Adele the girl. Added that if people find out about the existence of the device, they might even use it to listen to others. Elliot knew that with this car and Max's plans, the girl could get support. However, after a couple of moments, the young man made a decision and stood by the girl. He promised in this recap manhwa that this invention would remain just their joint secret. Sometime later, Adele prepared spicy garlic pork thighs and pork thighs with vegetables, especially for the prince. She asked the young man to try both dishes and rate them according to his preferences. Thanks to this, Adele learned that the young man doesn't like spicy food that much. Then, he took some meat and vegetables and invited him to try them separately. The prince was very embarrassed that the young girl was going to feed him alone. He was very embarrassed, but had already accepted the food from the girl. Kyle knew it was thanks to Adele. He couldn't focus on the taste of the dish itself. After finishing the meal, the most unpleasant part was washing the dishes. Adele. She understood that no one else could handle this except her, so she mustered up her courage. However, suddenly the girl's kitchen door opened and someone entered. It turned out to be Mario, who was supposed to come home, but he was delayed at the Imperial Palace. The boy admitted he didn't want to go back but wanted to stay and work as an Imperial Chef. He explained that one of the judges recommended him as Adele's assistant. The young man hoped to be able to stay with the girl and help her in the kitchen. Adele was literally blinded by his wonderful beauty and decided that she really could use an assistant. Meanwhile, the nobles discussed how the Marquis's ex-girlfriend became the Imperial Chef. Because of that, they started joking about the boy and believing that she dumped him. The Marquis was very angry. He even smashed his wine glass on the floor. He understood perfectly that because of what happened, those around him began to mock him, the Marquis. He deliberately did everything possible to have nothing to do with this woman. He thought she would never show up in front of him again. At first, the girl meant nothing to him. She was just a pawn in his game. However, now she not only approached the Imperial Palace, but also had the prince's support. Now he managed to distance himself from the conversation. But this could happen again, so he needed to get rid of her at that moment. The Marquis heard something that could help him in his plans. There were rumors that the Emperor didn't have much time left to live. Besides, they talked about Max, who lost a lot of money. The Marquis decided to take advantage of these rumors and steer them in the direction he needed. At that moment in the kitchen, Adele was preparing new dishes, and at the same time telling the recipe to her assistant. Mario was very happy to be able to help the girl while also learning something new. His help turned out to be really useful because it made the main chef's job much easier. Even the boy admitted that the girl is an excellent cook and still has a lot to learn. He remembered that once, she told him that with a touch of accents, a dish could become more interesting. At that moment, Mario got too close, so the little fox got angry and chased him away. Mars protected his lover and didn't allow any man to get close to her. Only in the girl's arms did he turn back into a cute little fox. A little later, the inventor, Elliot, also entered the kitchen looking for Adele. In fact, he came quite often because he could have lunch with the girl. This time, Adele prepared the balls by mixing risotto, then covering the cheese with breadcrumbs and frying them. However, he added a bit more flying fish roe to his ball to give it a new flavor. After that, he carefully dipped it in boiling oil and fried it until it was crispy. He served the soup with baguette and mozzarella cheese. The trio together tasted the dish simultaneously that the girl had prepared for the Emperor's dinner: fried onion, salty beef broth. The baguette was soaked and soft, and all this made the perfect combination with the mozzarella cheese. Everyone liked the dish. But Elliot came up with an idea, so the boy immediately ran to his lab and promised he would share the details later. Mario was very surprised by the strange behavior of the boy. Even Adele agreed with him a little later, when the girl finished her business. She went to see her friend in the lab. She asked him to explain what he came up with that made him run back so fast. His explanation was very complicated, so Adele didn't understand a word she asked to get to the point, but Elliot fell to his knees and asked her to marry him. Adele realized that the boy took her request too literally and asked him to start over. Then Elliot said that today's lunch was hard on the outside, but very soft and unusual on the inside then. After lunch, he came up with a great idea. But first, the boy wanted to tell the girl that he had found Max. Thanks to that little piece of paper the girl left in the pan, he was able to trace his location. Elliot was lucky to be able to use a model of the capital in his lab. Thanks to this, the boy could see that Count Max was already home. The inventor knew there were many villains against Adele. After these words, the girl realized that Elliot understood the structure of the Imperial Palace much better than she thought. She also knew a lot, because the Imperial Chef position isn't that easy. However, the alchemist promised that from now on he could protect the girl. That's why he asked her to marry him, so he could always be close to her. However, Adele didn't take his words seriously and laughed at them. She was grateful, but she believed that marriage should be with someone she was willing to dedicate her whole life to. Then the inventor admitted that he wanted to dedicate his life to Adele and thought it all through carefully. So once again, he knelt down, took her hand and asked her to marry him. The girl was very grateful for the offer but still decided to decline it. She believed that marriage was an important topic, so it was better to address other issues first. Elliot got carried away, so much that he forgot to show his main invention. The guy put the ball back into the tubes and made the machine play the recorded voice. You could hear Max's hawk going to various houses asking for money. However, no one believed him anymore, and no one wanted to cooperate with him. Apparently, the man couldn't even pay his main debt, and the threats became more severe. The Count had completely lost the trust of those around him. So now was the perfect time to destroy him. However, Adele decided to take advantage of the situation and wait a little first. Now the girl was a cook, and for the first time she personally brought food to the dragons. Everyone knows that the way a dragon appears in human form is as a guest from a distant kingdom. So Adele came in person to find out if the dragon had any special food preferences, after which the girl showed her new dish that she had brought for the king, which turned out to be a sweet and sour salad with seaweed. Next was a refreshing grapefruit drink in a glass, and the main course of this meal was spicy chicken. The dragon was impressed and hoped the food would be as tasty as it smelled. However, he literally swallowed all the salad she brought in one go. He also really liked the main dish because the dragon loves spicy food. He asked the girl to keep cooking the same way and bring him similar food. The dragon explained that the little fox was very quiet and always took care of his younger brothers and sisters. Then Adele was worried that she had done something wrong because he became aggressive, however. The dragon noticed that the girl was filling her head with all kinds of nonsense and asked Adele to go to the kitchen and bring Marge back. After a couple of minutes of conversation, the dragon said that the reason for this behavior is very standard. He explained that the little fox became aggressive due to a lack of affection from its owner. It felt lonely because the girl wasn't giving it enough attention. Because of this, it was jealous of the owner, and this resulted in such aggressive behavior. Adele promised that she would definitely improve and pay more attention to the little guy. She had never had pets before, so she thought she was doing quite well. The girl tried to remember how her friends from her home world treated their animals. Adele recalled what they did at home and how they took care of their pets then. Decided to use her money to buy the little fox many toys and various decorations. Adele hoped that through this she could improve its life. She spent so much money that even the store manager wanted to meet her. Adele enjoyed spending time with her pet and spending her money on him. The girl was walking through the city when a boy called out to her. He saw her for the first time, but the baby knew her name very well. He looked quite scruffy, but at the same time healthy. Adele was very friendly with the boy. She stopped and talked to him. The boy admitted that he also loves to cook and wants to become a great chef. After that, the boy pulled out a piece of charcoal and asked for an autograph from his idol. Adele happily signed the boy's hand and wished him good luck in the future. Afterwards, the boy thanked her for the best day of his life and said goodbye to the girl. This encounter really lifted our Adele's spirits and made her believe even more in herself a little later. The girl was walking and saw several palace doctors conferring with each other. She heard them talking about a strange illness that was attacking someone. She heard that there were no adequate medicines in the palace and that even the strongest swordsman couldn't resist the illness. Thanks to the words about the swordsman, Adele guessed the identity of the patient. After this, the girl immediately went to the kitchen and started preparing delicious and healthy dishes. All the ingredients had to be fresh and the work surface perfectly clean. Mario finished chopping the tomatoes and the chicken, so he asked about the next step. After this, Adele began soaking the rice and at the same time explained what it was for. The girl mixed some ingredients by hand and tried to grind them as much as possible. After that, she asked Mario to fry the tomatoes, add a little water and stir. After that, she placed everything in the cauldron and hung it over the fire so that nothing would burn. Once the squash was cooked, it would be necessary to mash it well. At that moment, Mario noticed that they were preparing too many dishes today. Adele tried to explain this by saying that the young man is just very picky about food. She was worried that he wasn't feeling well precisely because of her. She was worried because it was Kyle who helped her become an Imperial Chef. She prepared many things, but it still seemed too little to her. Mario believed that this wasn't the only reason for the girl's strange behavior. However, he chose not to continue this topic and reminded them that the rice should be ready by now. After that, they only had to take the final step of preparing the dish. Then all the dishes were packed up and put into a large bag. Mario was surprised that the girl wanted to carry all the food herself and didn't ask for help. He reminded her that she managed to do this only because she had a wonderful assistant. The girl was still a bit afraid of the guard because once she had been kicked out the door. However, this time, she wasn't going to give up even if she wasn't forgiven. This happened because His Highness the Prince didn't allow Chef Adele to enter his room. Adele didn't understand why the young prince suddenly didn't want to see her and forbade her to visit him. However, the guard explained that he feared contaminating someone, so he didn't let anyone in because of this. Adele had to ask her old friend Elliot for help. However, she asked him to act without any stupidness and not to propose to her again. She explained that she was a bit uncomfortable with the kind of help she needed. Adele asked for a protective suit that would cover all parts of her body. The alchemist assumed that the girl was once again planning something dangerous. He recalled how once she had gone to the dragon's lair with only spices and pans in her hands. The boy scolded the girl and told her that nothing is more important than her health and safety. Adele noticed that because of her aversion to the prince, the alchemist reminded her of Mars, which is why she didn't want to say she wanted to visit the sick Kyle. However, she didn't have to lie because Elliot admitted he had a tailored suit for dealing with dangerous things. That's why they always order too much. Adele was really happy about this and thanked her friend for her help, the alchemist. He realized that the girl didn't take him seriously and didn't see him as a guy. Adele received her clothes. Protective, she returned to Prince Kyle's chambers. The knight had seen the alchemist's protective suit several times, but still he couldn't disobey the prince's order. Then Adele remembered that she was the one who could heal the emperor with her food, so she hoped that this time her food would also help the prince. Only after this did the guard decide to trust the girl and let her in. Adele was in this wing of the castle for the first time. She felt a little uncomfortable. Everything around her seemed very abandoned and looked like a haunted house. The girl began to walk from room to room, calling out loud for the prince. In the end, the only thing left for her to explore, it was his private bedroom. The room was luxurious, but not even there did anyone show signs of life inside. In this recap manhwa, Adele was about to leave when she suddenly heard a strange sound. From the opposite end of the room, the girl approached and saw that the prince was curled up in pain. Adele ran towards him and carefully tried to lift his head. It took a lot of strength to help the young man stand up. After that, the cook laid the prince down on the couch and helped him rest. At some point, Kyle suddenly took her hand and laid it on the couch. The prince loomed over her and didn't seem like himself. The girl felt embarrassed and started shouting loudly, trying to wake the young man. This helped, and the prince regained consciousness, immediately pulling away from the girl. Everything was floating in his eyes. She laid the prince down on the sofa and helped him rest. At some point, Kyle suddenly took her hand and laid it on the sofa. The prince loomed over her and seemed different. The girl got embarrassed and started shouting loudly, trying to wake the young man. This helped, and the prince regained consciousness, immediately pulling away from the girl as everything floated in his eyes. He only partially understood what was happening and explained his unusual outfit, saying it was specifically a protection against any illness. The boy was a bit embarrassed that the common cold was seen as something very dangerous. Suddenly, the young man went silent and then collapsed forward. He was unconscious on the floor, and Adele ran, trying to help him after a while. The prince came to and felt a bandage on his head. Only then did he realize that everything that happened was not a dream. But it really happened. The prince apologized for the incident and said he felt bad due to his temperature. He admitted that he hadn't eaten anything for several days, and that's why he fainted. Adele was angry because the prince wasn't eating or drinking medication, so he couldn't recover. She admitted she was scared because the young man had lost consciousness. As an apology, she insisted that the prince eat in her presence. The girl lifted the lid and showed the young man several types of soft food. She said she brought a bit of everything but could go back for more. In the first dish, fresh tomatoes were cooked well with sugar to create a soft and tasty soup. Adele watched closely the expression on the prince's face. To assess his reaction, however, she immediately realized he didn't like it much. The next was a smooth pumpkin soup that she and Mario prepared together. The mild sweetness was achieved by mixing the pumpkin with cream and blending it. The next thing I tried was a soup that consisted of a small amount of chicken broth and tender meat. However, the prince liked the last dish more. The mild flavor and light combination of sweetness and salt created a perfect harmony. Adele immediately noticed that the young man was delighted with this dish. She was glad to finally please her friend. Adele was happy that the young man finished the whole plate, which is why the girl promised she would cook any dish he wanted. The girl hoped that thanks to her food, the prince could recover faster. However, she had no idea what danger was lurking ahead. A little later, when she was in the alchemist's lab, an accident occurred. Adele was very afraid that her friend might get hurt because of her actions. Due to her carelessness, the girl touched the test tube and her friend's face got hurt. However, Elliot said that she definitely didn't say anything and explained that test tubes are so fragile that they are sensitive, even to the temperature of the air and the human body. After these words, Adele realized that this whole place was a ticking time bomb. However, the alchemist reassured her, telling her that the girl was safe as long as she was with him. Adele noticed that he had returned to his usual self and made a joke about it. At that moment, the girl's attention was drawn by a crash coming from the car. The alchemist had set up an automatic notification when Count Max left the house, and rumors spread throughout the city that he had turned into a wet rat. Adele was surprised that her old friends spoke so poorly of him. However, she remembered that the prince had said the same thing recently, but dismissed it all as a coincidence. There were people who decided to take advantage of the Count's weakness and passed him a document for 50,000. Adele was shocked by such a sum and dreamed that money would be hers. A stranger gave 50,000 in exchange for the Count to hand over his belongings. He decides how to get the money, but even his interlocutor must be treated with respect. After this, the signal was blocked because a carriage passed by. Adele assumed that the Count sold his body for 50,000, so she wanted to intercept him. She was going to go to that dangerous place because for that amount, she could buy a shop in the city center. The alchemist said that since the girl needed so much money, he agreed to give her all his savings. Adele was really moved, but decided to take a different path. She pretended she was just curious, but she actually wanted to steal Max's dirty money. You have to be responsible for your actions, that's why she didn't read anything wrong. The girl wanted to refuse the alchemist's help and try to manage on her own. Adele was really happy that Mars agreed to help her with everything. However, this moment returned to Mario, and the girl realized she had another assistant. After that, they went together to the market to buy food. But the girl pursued her goal and explained that, for better flavor, it's useful to go to the market and personally select the products. Mario accepted his mentor's words as truth and easily believed him. The girl didn't want to deceive him, but with him she felt calmer than alone. In fact, Adele wanted to check out a place that was near the market and pointed to the Count. However, there were too many alleys in the city, so she had to explore each one of them. Mario pointed out that it's better not to look down these alleys. because you never know who might be waiting there. Adele pretended to look down there by accident and opted to change the subject. Still, she did it, and next time she would come back and prepare well, the guys. They were returning to the palace when they heard some noise and saw a crowd in front of the door thanks to his weapon. Mario knew it was a common peasant. However, the boy knew for sure that such a thing would never be allowed in the palace. The man noticed Adele's chef and immediately got angry, walking straight toward her. Mario tried to protect his friend and blocked the stranger's path. The man grabbed the Imperial Chef's hand and pulled him hard. He said it was a bad girl who tricked his son into running away from home. Adele didn't even understand what was happening and assumed he was talking about Mario. However, none of this trio understood what they were talking about. The man said his son's name was Alejandro, but this didn't help at all to resolve the situation. Then he said the girl had recently signed his hand. Only after this did Adele remember the boy she had recently met in the city. After this, the whole company headed to a quiet place to hear his story. The man said the guy fought with his father. Then he packed his things and ran away, and it was all Adele's fault. The girl didn't understand at all what had happened, and why the man was blaming her. She understood he was worried about his son, but asked him to calm down. The man lost his temper, so he was punished with the little fox's fire star. Mars protected his lover and didn't let anyone shout at her. Mario carefully examined the man and realized he had briefly lost consciousness. The assistant found the man's ID with an address and offered to take him home. Absolutely no information from this tablet gave Adele anything new. She headed to the judge and asked them to send the man to the address indicated in the ID document. Mars felt like a true hero because he could protect his lover. Mario was disappointed by the indifference with which the girl was taking this incident. However, he noticed that she could do whatever she wanted because no one could stop her. Adele realized that she was going to go with him in a carriage to the man's house. It seemed very suspicious to Mario that he suddenly changed his mind and decided to go with her. The boy explained that he was worried about the girl's safety. After all, the two were like kids who didn't understand anything about the world, taking home an aggressive person. However, the girl had completely different intentions. She was interested in the address for her identification. This was a great opportunity to search all the alleys for the missing boy, and at the same time for Count Max. After a while, Adele called at the man's house, and a young brunette came out to greet her. The boy admitted that he was her father and was worried about being able to hurt the girl. However, she said she was fine, and that her father was lying in the carriage. Unfortunately, he lost consciousness and suffered some burns, but basically, he's okay. Some time later, the man woke up in his house and was surprised about where he was. A group of friends had already told the mercenary's son what had happened recently. He reminded his father that they could strip him of his rank for such behavior. The man always advised the boy to carry his title of knight with honor. Therefore, he himself should have apologized. Adele was delighted that this young man had forced his father to admit his mistake. Then she asked why the boy didn't care about his brother and treated them so well. The boy admitted that it wasn't so simple and left the fox to take care of his father. He admitted he was sure that everything was fine with his younger brother. The man invited the girl to go out for a while and explained that Alexander knew the alley very well. The food disappears from the house, which means he periodically runs home. If he tells this to his father, his younger brother will definitely be locked inside and prohibited from going out. In fact, when he was a kid, he wanted to be a chef, but his father was indifferent and often raised his voice. Adele was impressed by this story and promised to definitely find the little one. The girl suggested that we first explore all the alleys that were not far from the house. However, at that moment, Mario caught their attention. Who knew where the boy had fled? The boys went to Alexander's personal room, which was completely filled with various pictures of Adele. Now the girl understood why the boy's father recognized her immediately. The older brother admitted that when Alejandro escaped, they immediately searched the whole house, but they couldn't find him anywhere. Mario noticed that if someone was specifically looking for him, they would leave clues. He admitted that he often managed it himself, so he can be trusted on this matter. Adele knew that Mario was the heir. Of an entire generation of chefs, he was born to be a great cook. That's why he has what it takes in the first place. The boys went to the attic and decided to check it out there. Adele suggested the boy hide there, but Mario disagreed with her. First, the assistant opened the window and saw dust marks on the frame. After that, he screamed loudly and asked Alexander to come down the stairs. The boy decided to obey and immediately went back up to the room. The boy didn't understand how they found him so quickly, but then he saw Adele and apologized because his dad went to see the girl. Due to his disappearance, Adele admitted that the man was simply worried, and that's why he didn't act very carefully. After that, Alejandro grabbed the girl by the hands and asked her to take him to his house. He promised he would work hard and become the best chef in the world. Mario pulled the boy away from the girl and told him that he shouldn't vent his emotions with her. Alexander was surprised that two famous chefs were in his house. Mario explained that if the boy had been born in his family, he would have become a chef. However, he himself initially wanted to become a knight, and that's why he also hid from his family. He went to the rooftop, but that wasn't the solution to all his problems. Mario pointed out that you can't run away from your problems because they won't solve themselves. After that, they didn't go down and decided to talk to Alexander's father. The man wanted the boy to go to the academy where true knights are trained. This is a place where you can really learn many skills that are useful for society. The place is sponsored by nobles, so you don't have to worry about work, and even a commoner can study there. If Alexander wants to be a culinary specialist after graduating from the academy, he will be able to take responsibility for his own life. Kids need time to find their own path. Alejandro's father agreed, and the boy began to thank his saviors. The boy was happy to be able to enter the academy, but still cooking. The older brother Alejandro thanked the girl for her help and promised her that in the future he could repay her for it. After that, Adele went home. She was sad because she never managed to explore the alley. Just before leaving, the girl noticed that Mart had gotten lost, and then the little one returned. The fox brought something strange and held it in its teeth. Adele picked up the strange thing and examined it closely all around. The girl said goodbye to Mario and headed to her room to rest. However, the first thing she decided to do was look at the strange little thing the little fox brought her, which was a silver coin with engravings, and Adele knew what it meant. She saw this pattern in the story while reading a novel on her tablet. It's about the emblem of a criminal organization that appears at the beginning of the plot with a drawing of a wolf. Now the girl knew that Count Max had gone to this organization. However, she didn't understand what the drawn moon and the number 14 meant. The next day started out as the most normal day, where Adele had to prepare the food. The girl was going to serve the emperor ravioli with eggplant inside. Mario doubted this flavor combination, but Adele convinced him to start. She said that the young man needed to chop the pork very finely, then mix it well with the vegetables and add all the necessary seasonings. Then it was necessary to assemble the ravioli in such a way that the minced meat stayed inside the eggplant. The young man was very skeptical about this dish. After that, Marte lit the fire and the guys added a bit of dough to the boiling oil to check the temperature. After this, Adele dipped the ravioli in the batter and carefully submerged them in the oil, then took them out, removed the excess oil and poured several sauces on them. Mario immediately noticed that he had never liked the taste of eggplant. However, he still decided to try the dishes that the chef taught him. The young man bit into the crispy chicken and felt the filling was very soft. It was simply amazing how the girl managed to achieve that appearance. Mario admitted that Adele is a real success in the kitchen, and that her decisions should be trusted. The girl saved most of the food for the emperor, and then reserved some for the alchemist. She explained to him that he works a lot, and sometimes forgets to eat, so she helps him. Immediately after that, the girl went to her friend who explained to her how to decipher the inscription on the coin. The moon is a designation for the most terrible place in the capital, like the slums or the outskirts. There's absolutely no security, so it's an ideal place for anarchy, and the number 14 means we're talking about Lane, 14 on the outskirts of the capital. Adele was very grateful to her friend for helping her solve this riddle. She told the man not to worry, because soon they could steal 50.000000 and also get rid of Count Max, who was bothering them once and for all. However, Elliot didn't understand how the girl planned to achieve this. Adele had her own idea, so the guys gathered the next day. They put cloaks on so that no one would recognize them by their clothes or figure. The boys arrived at Lane 14 on the outskirts of the capital and began to be examined. At some point, Elliot called the girl and asked her to stop for a moment. He showed her something strange and asked the girl to put it over her eyes. The alchemist said that if Adele puts it on, no one will recognize her. He tried. He explained the mechanism by which the mask works, but the girl still didn't understand anything. Elliot was glad that thanks to this mask, he could observe the beauty of the girl that wasn't hidden under the hood. He himself put on exactly the same, so now the guys could easily go anywhere without anyone recognizing them. The alchemist asked the girl to follow him and try to stay as close as possible. He couldn't believe Adele was going to that place alone. However, the girl feared the alchemist would discover that Marte is a spirit animal and do something. After a while, the guys found suspicious boxes located on the outskirts and decided to leave the money for Max to come. Instead of the date based on the conversation, Adele was worried about having to face criminals. At some point, she unconsciously leaned her head on her friend's shoulder, surprising him. The girl immediately realized her mistake, but the boy had already gotten a racing heart and admitted that everything was fine, just that he was a little worried. The guys didn't have time to discuss this because just then, a noise was heard coming from the direction of the boxes. Soon they saw a man in a raincoat had come to ask for money. He went to the boxes, opened the lid, and put money into one of them in a bag. Then the man closed the box and tried to flee as fast as possible before he was seen. The alchemist looked at his handheld device to make sure there was no one near them. After that, Adele quickly jumped up and ran straight to the drawer where the bag should be. The girl took the money and looked for something to replace it. Nearby, she saw a trash bag and stuffed it in a box instead of a bag of money. At that moment, she noticed people approaching, so Adele barely had time to hide. She escaped just in time, because a second later, Count Max appeared around the corner looking very scared and nervous, so he arrived early. After that, all the guys could do was simply sit and watch. After a while, the Count opened the box and saw that inside there was a bag, however. Instead of money, there was some kind of garbage inside this bag. Before the Count had time to do anything, a loud sound was heard and a bright light appeared. A couple of seconds later, security guards appeared, intending to arrest the man. They had already caught his accomplice, so they just needed to find a nobleman to contact this group of mafiosos. Count Max was so desperate to get money that he didn't even ask who hired him. After this, the head of security turned to the commander and asked if it was worth reporting this to the palace. This commander turned out to be the second Prince Kyle, whom Adele didn't expect to see at all. The guy explained that he planned to ignore the letters, of which it was difficult to even determine the identity of the criminal. The information turned out to be very valuable for a moment. The prince looked exactly in the direction where our heroes were hiding. However, there was no one there. So Kylo returned to his conversation with the Count the last time he managed to escape, literally at the last moment. But now he pretends not to understand at all what the prince is talking about. The young man was not going to tolerate such disrespect, so he threatened punishment for the next day. Rumors spread throughout the city that the Count had been stripped of his title and sentenced to a year of prison. In addition to committing a crime, Max is drowning in debt and abandoned by his own family. It was all decided thanks to the prince's intervention, who allowed the emperor to rest and recover his health. Adele wanted to enter the master's emergency room and visit him, however. The guard had not allowed the girl to enter for several days and did not give the exact reason Adele was arguing with a security guard. When Prince Kyle approached her and asked to talk, the girl admitted that she wanted to ask him some questions herself. The prince said he personally intervened in the incident with Count Max because he was worried about the girl Adele, did not understand how he could care about her and say nothing about her condition. She reminded him how recently a young man lay unconscious on the ground. The girl noted that if he didn't care, he wouldn't cook for her so much. Adele didn't know what the prince's feelings for her were, but she was sincerely grateful to him only at that moment. The girl understood what words were coming out of her mouth. She was very embarrassed and blushed terribly from head to toe. The prince immediately tried to calm the girl and admitted that he wanted to help with this matter, only for her now. He understood why his romance with the Count had gone so smoothly and easily. In fact, the prince had already discovered her secret a long time ago and had been helping them from the outside. Adele was very embarrassed, so she wanted to know how much the young man knew. She was even more surprised when the prince admitted that he had heard around 50.000,000 of penta. Adele decided not to ask how he knew, but she was curious to know why the boy decided to help. Absolutely everyone in the empire believed that the emperor was at the forefront of this operation, however. The prince pointed out that this was his personal decision, just as his feelings told him the little fox was in Adele's room. When he heard someone approaching the door, the baby approached its owner and waited for her to start petting and kissing it. However, the girl seemed to be in a daze. She walked and didn't notice anything around her. In fact, Adele still couldn't comprehend what had happened. Recently, the girl recalled the smiling face of the prince and the words he said to her. She didn't understand at all why they treated her so well. Why Kyle, the second prince and the envied swordmaster, cared so much about her. Because of this, the girl's heart began to race, and she worried about where this would lead her. Adele entered the kitchen early in the morning and checked the cleanliness of the appliances and the quality of the ingredients. When all the preparations were completed, Adele announced that today they would prepare something special. Mario was doing the work assigned to him, but he didn't understand what the prince was doing in the kitchen. In this recap manhwa, he had been in that room quite frequently lately, especially when Adele was around. From outside, it seemed like he was getting personal training from a chef, because he kept asking about cooking. The girl explained how to add egg and cheese to a fried tomato sauce with bacon, onion and garlic, and bake it in her homeland. This dish was called Eggs in Hell, because it was very spicy. Mars was already approaching and closely watching that the prince didn't cross the line and didn't interfere with his lover. The first step was to fry the bacon until it had enough grease. Then add the rest of the ingredients and saute well, and at the end add a bit of aromatic tomato sauce and mix well. Mario was worried it might be too spicy, but Adele said the color of the tomatoes fooled him, although it could be too spicy for the prince. She prepared a separate dinner for him. The men got ravioli with different kinds of fillings, which made Mario jealous. The prince appreciated the girl's care, so he happily agreed to try all the types Adele eagerly awaited his reaction watching closely. Kyle laughed and said it was one of the most delicious things he had ever eaten. Mario watched this couple from the side and realized something unusual was happening. After that, Adele rolled up her sleeves and said it was time to move on to the next stage. The girl took a spatula and carefully separated the tomato paste to make room for the eggs after that. She took fresh chicken eggs and carefully broke them into the centers of the resulting holes. Then she covered it with a lid and waited until the surface hardened and the dish was ready, and Adele noticed that those eggs taste better if eaten with freshly baked bread. After this, the girl handed the finished dish to the emperor's assistant and wished him a good meal. Before the girl had time to free herself, she noticed that Mario, Kyle, and Mars were finishing the ravioli. The men managed to eat almost everything, but saved a small portion for the girl herself. Mario admitted he barely had time to stop, even though it wasn't the first time he tried these ravioli. With this, he wanted to make it clear to the prince that the girl was the first to prepare this dish for him. Adele noticed that the young prince, who usually eats little, was eating a lot of ravioli. The young man admitted he liked the ones with shrimp inside. Adele specially prepared several different types with shrimp, corn, cheese, pork, and lamb, then served them to the prince. All the shrimp ravioli left on the plate. The prince enjoyed a delicious meal, but didn't want to take away his lunch portion from the girl. Moreover, he didn't want to share with Mario, with whom he felt some competition for the girl's heart. Before the boys had time to finish eating, the kitchen door opened and guards entered. The captain of the older brother's night order bowed before the prince and greeted him. He didn't come alone, but was accompanied by a whole entourage and knights. All the vagabonds immediately approached Adele and aimed their weapons at her. The commander admitted they had come to capture the traitor who had poisoned His Majesty the Emperor. These words surprised everyone present greatly, because Adele would never do this. Mars didn't like that they were taking his lover away, but the girl stopped him. Mario also didn't believe Adele could be guilty of anything. Even the prince tried to stop the guard commander and asked why they were taking the cook commander. Sam didn't want to get into conflict with the younger prince, so he was forced to respond saying that this girl would no longer be the emperor's cook. Poison was found in the food she served at his table. These dishes were extremely strange and unusual, so they immediately thought of her. The prince explained that he observed the cooking process, and that the cook couldn't add anything to the food. He declared that Adele was just a suspect, so he couldn't turn a blind eye until there was evidence. Young Prince Kyle grabbed the girl's hand and forced the guard to let her go. He seemed very serious, and ordered the cook to follow him to the office, so they walked. Kyle and Adele in front and the guards right behind them. The girl immediately realized that what she had feared the most had recently happened. She only feared that the prince would be very disappointed in her after what happened. The commander didn't want to leave the girl in the prince's office. He was going to send her to prison, however. Let me remind Kyle that she is just a suspect and therefore deserves appropriate treatment for the situation. She might soon cease to be the Imperial Chef, but until then she will still deserve respect. The prince ordered that 2 knights be placed at the entrance to prevent the girl from escaping. Adele asked the young man to show her the dishes in which the poison was found, however. This couldn't be done because if the suspect returned to the crime scene, there would be even more noise. The young man gently tucked the girl's hair behind her ear and said he didn't want to send her to prison. After that, he left, leaving Adele sitting alone in his office. The girl was more worried about the fact that someone had poisoned her dish, and the emperor could have suffered. After all, in this case, she would definitely be accused of treason and punished. Sam noted that this was too lenient a punishment for the criminal who should have been imprisoned immediately. The commander believed the girl had committed attempted murder and treason. However, the prince noticed that if Sam said one more word, she would never be able to speak again. This scared the young man a lot, so he took her words seriously. After this, the prince left the guards and went to deal with this problem, judging by the time the poison was recently found, but the knights immediately went to the cook. Near the emperor's room, the prince encountered his older brother, who was waiting for him. Hyperion was not happy that his younger brother arrived so late to visit their father. He said the doctor prescribed absolute rest for the emperor, so it was better not to disturb him. The crown prince added that the poisoned food was immediately discarded. Kyle did not understand how they could get rid of the evidence if they had not yet found the culprit. However, the older brother was sure that the culprit was the cook, who was expelled from high society for her shameful behavior. Then Kyle suggested that the poison could have been added to the food by whoever served it to the emperor today. However, it was today when his servant and closest advisor, who had been around for many years, served food to the emperor, of course. He was also under suspicion and was also interrogated. However, the heir did not even understand how these two people could be put on the same level. Kyle realized that this was a trap, because first of all, it was necessary to send knights to monitor the kitchen. He deliberately disposed of the poisoned food and waited until everything was clean before rushing to the kitchen. Kyle had one last hope that his father at least had not taken all the poison. The heir assured him that the emperor felt bitterness and immediately spat out the food. Kyle was sure that Hyperion had decided to take advantage of this opportunity to get rid of Adele, who had irritated him for a long time. It was beneficial for him to dispose of the evidence, because this was enough to accuse a simple cook without a title. However, at some point the prince suggested that something was wrong, that it was not poison at all. At that moment, Adele was sitting in the prince's office, waiting for someone to come to her and tell her what was happening. She trusted His Highness, but she needed to be there to protect herself. At that moment, a little fox climbed into the office wanting to support its lover. The girl hoped that everything was okay with the emperor, because lately he had been getting sick often. If a man took even a sip of poison, her life could be in danger. Adele sat alone for quite some time before the door opened and someone came in. It turned out to be Prince Kyle, whom the girl immediately rushed to meet because she knew the emperor was okay, and that the name of the criminal was still unknown. The prince said they couldn't determine the type of poison, because all the evidence and the dishes were destroyed. The girl said there could very well be poison left in her kitchen if she used it, but Mario had already managed to clean everything up. The emperor spat out the food as soon as he tasted it, so it wasn't poisoned dishes. Kyle assumed it was the food itself that was served to him. The circle of suspects narrowed down to those who had access to this food, sir. Rudolph brought food today, but he has a lot to lose if he betrays the emperor, so of all the suspects, the only one left was the cook herself, Adele. Therefore, the prince assumed that the girl didn't poison anyone, but just served spoiled food at the table. Adele immediately got angry, but the prince asked to hear him out. He reminded us that it was the middle of summer and tomatoes and eggs spoiled very quickly. However, Adele couldn't believe he would offer to tell her that she had served a spoiled product. The girl said that if the food had gone bad, she would have noticed immediately. The prince understood that the cook didn't like it, but this was her only chance. The emperor also assumed that the girl had fallen into a trap and couldn't get out of it, which is why he decided to limit the punishment to a minimum. To preserve Adele's position as much as possible instead of prison, they offered her a month of house arrest, and she would also be deprived of all privileges equivalent to the title of gentleman. Adele didn't understand why, no matter how hard she tried. All that was left for her were miserable crumbs. She understood that this was just an attempt to protect her from worse consequences. However, she was really furious and didn't want to give up just like that. Everyone knew perfectly well that she was innocent, but still they wanted to punish her. It was better to put her in prison than to turn her into a bad cook who dared to feed the emperor spoiled food. Adele understood that she needed irrefutable evidence, the same dishes that were served to the emperor. However, she understood that the remains of her food had been destroyed a long time ago and wouldn't be used. Then the girl waited for another plan to come to her. She needed to find perfectly preserved dishes to prove her innocence. Only then, Adele remembered that she actually had proof that the food was neither spoiled nor poisoned. She explained that she sent some food to the alchemist every day to feed him. Lately, he's been so busy investigating that he completely forgets to eat. Therefore, the girl hoped that the boy hadn't touched the food yet. Then they would have a chance. Adele said that if you tell the alchemist that she sent him to the prince, they would let him in immediately. Up until that moment, Adele had only thought about how to survive until tomorrow. But all her zeal brought her was suffering, so she decided not to concern herself with small things anymore. Instead, she would do everything possible. Adele announced that she demanded a formal trial and accepted going to prison in this country. There's no presumption of innocence, so criminals are immediately incarcerated. The only thing the girl asked was to be sent to a prison. Specifically in the prison, the girl was immediately received by a warden named Sarah. Adele was glad to meet this woman and hoped they would become friends. The girl understood she would have to see this woman for an entire month, so it was better to be her friend. Plus, she would need to use the kitchen to prepare a delicious meal. Seeing the friendly attitude of the new prisoner, Sarah hoped to become friends with Bibi, the name of another inmate who had been here for a long time. It had been several years since she had made new friends, so she remained silent all the time. Sarah explained that the girl was a bit shy, but wouldn't offend anyone. Adele knew this because she had read about a girl who, at the age of 20, became the chief maid of the imperial court. The empress valued her so much that despite her humble origins, she herself was going to marry her off to a noble. However, after the empress's sudden death, everything changed 7 years ago. The empress died from blood poisoning, and the girl was accused of not wanting the empress to take a bitter medicine, so she gave her running water. The girl defended herself, but this unfortunately led to nothing. The day the empress died, it turned out that instead of medicine, the plate was full of common-colored water. Due to what happened, the girl tried too hard and immediately lost consciousness. Many doubted her guilt and tried to defend and justify her. The empress refused to drink the bitter medicine, and there were witnesses who saw Bibi trying to get her drunk. Everyone said the girl had no reason to want the empress dead. However, during the trial, the girl asked how Her Majesty the Empress was. The emperor was furious at these words, so he applied the most severe punishment. The thing is, by then, the empress had already died and her husband was angry. Adele understood that no matter how angry the emperor was, this was too harsh a punishment for such a dubious crime. Besides, this old prison was about to burst and threaten to collapse. Before the girl had time to think about it, a piece of the ceiling fell right in front of her and hit the ground. If it had been 1 millimeter forward, she would have died a long time ago. That's why only those who obey the emperor's orders like Bibi remain in this prison. All the servants and attendants of the imperial palace fear becoming guards of this prison. Adele approached the girl and introduced herself, trying to get her to speak. However, Sarah noticed that Bibi hadn't spoken in years and barely ate anything. Throughout her time in prison, her diet consisted only of burnt sugar. When Bibi was about to faint, Sarah would give her sugar or sprinkle it on her bread. Adele realized it wasn't just about sweetness. Since the girl only ate burnt sugar, she assumed it had something to do with pleasant memories, a dessert with lots of brown caramel sauce. It was more like a dish with a crunchy caramel crust like a creme brulee. The novel said she was loyal to the empress and no more information. Suddenly, Adele had an idea and asked to use the kitchen. Thanks to the sugar and a small amount of baking powder, the girl managed to create the desired dessert. Adele hoped to make the dish that Bibi really wanted to try. The girl touched the food for the first time in a long time and took a bite of the cookies that Adele had sold on the street. However, the strange thing was that the girl just tasted the dessert and immediately returned it. Sarah even suggested that Adele's assumption was wrong. However, all her doubts vanished as soon as they saw Bibi begin to cry. It was at that moment that she remembered her beloved lover, who often invited her to the same dessert. After a few days, Adele realized that life in prison was perfect for her. She was guaranteed 8 hours of restorative sleep, and Mars came to visit her periodically. Furthermore, the girl agreed and was allowed into the kitchen to do whatever she wanted. Generally, criminals were handcuffed, but Sarah trusted her and managed without them. The girl really could become good friends with Sarah, so she enjoyed privileges. Adele liked the director's words that if someone didn't like something, they should find a replacement. Thanks to this, the girl was able to visit the kitchen and constantly prepare delicious food for herself and the others. All the prisoners immediately appreciated the girl's true talent. We noticed that even Vivi started eating well since Adele arrived. She joked that the girl didn't eat because Sarah was a terrible cook. Everyone was sure that a talented chef shouldn't disappear in prison. Moreover, everyone wondered how the girl ended up in this place in the first place. They assumed she had also crossed paths with someone influential. Adele also got hooked on the word and asked who Sarah was referring to. The girl assumed we were talking about Bibi, which scared her. Sarah said that as soon as they brought everyone, those around her kept saying she would be released soon. However, before the woman had time to finish her story, the girl walked over to them and ordered her to be quiet. This was the first time in a long time that Vivi started talking to someone and realized she was silent because she didn't want to talk. So there was no need to cook for her anymore. The girl asked to be left alone and not to be bothered with questions. She hoped they would let her die peacefully in this hole. Adele remembered the novel everyone was waiting for with absolute hope. The quick release of the girl, however. 7 years passed, and this did not happen. Not even the main character knew about this injustice. However, going against the Emperor's decision was too costly. Besides this, there was a second reason why no one could do anything. The fact is that the man who incriminated Bibi was none other than Earl Seton. Of course, the honest and principled Bibi constantly contradicted the Count, however. The Count would not dare to touch the Emperor's favorite while she was under her protection. He was scared. When the girl's engagement to the heir of a rival family was announced, and then disaster struck even though there was no evidence, many assumed it was the Count's tricks. However, everyone was too afraid to speak lest they provoke his wrath. No one dared to challenge the Count for Bibi and her release. That's why Adele said that if a girl wants to be left alone, she will be. However, Vivi admitted that she wanted to keep eating the dessert that the Empress once invited her to. That's why Adele promised that she would be delighted to teach the girl to cook it herself. Sarah even agreed to provide them with the prison kitchen so the girls could practice. The woman wanted Bibi to be happy again. That's why she wanted to help her. Only after these words did the girl realize how much support she had from the people around her. Bibi broke down crying from happiness and asked to be taught how to cook dessert. From that day on, the girl finally started to feel much better. Adele and Bibi were the same age and spirit, so they quickly became close. Besides the girl stopped constantly hiding in a corner from everyone, it's clear that this didn't happen overnight, but there were advances. At least she no longer rejected normal conversations like she used to do. Therefore, the girl's mood quickly returned to normal, and she recovered. Adele told Bibi a lot about what was happening in the world while she was in prison, about how she was expelled from her family and became a court cook herself. Of all the stories the girl liked to hear, the one she liked the most was about the youngest prince. She was glad that His Highness Kyle was finally eating normally. Thus, a whole month passed, and the day came when Elliot announced that no poison had been found in his food. Not only him, but also other royal alchemists checked everything multiple times and came to the same conclusion. Now people trust that Adele really couldn't have mixed any poison with the food. The judge, she asked if it was possible that the girl had prepared normal food and added poison only to the portion for the Emperor, but the alchemist said that this was too stupid and obvious. Moreover, the girl had no motive to kill the Emperor. She remembered that the girl came to serve the Emperor, which was the greatest honor for an ordinary person. However, people were still sure that among the two suspects, Adele and Cyril Wolf, the girl was the most suspicious. Furthermore, the servant regretted it, and the girl looked too good for someone who had spent an entire month in prison. Adele didn't feel guilty because she wasn't guilty, so there was no need to suffer. Judging solely by the degree of remorse, Adele is the only one who voluntarily went to prison. Rudolph, due to the recent events and the constant accusations, became very nervous and distrustful. People started to fight among themselves, arguing over which of the two suspects was more suspicious. They even suggested that the alchemist could deliberately tamper with the evidence to absolve the girl. At one point, the judge couldn't take it anymore and ordered everyone to shut up immediately. Thanks to what happened, Adele finally became convinced that the crime was orchestrated by the Count. The true heroine was an obedient daughter who always obeyed her father. None of those who accused her mentioned that the Count could have framed her, even though it was too obvious to ignore. The girl pointed out that she now finds herself in this situation only because she personally demanded an official trial. Additionally, she provided evidence that the royal family offered her a severe punishment without trial. Therefore, it was the judge who was interested in knowing why the girl summoned this court. From the novel, Adele knew that in this world there is neither prosecutor nor lawyer. The fate of the accused is decided solely by 3 ordinary judges. So if you want to remain free, it's better to admit your guilt, because remorse is the best way out. However, this amounts to death for the cook, which is why the girl was determined not to give up until the end. Adele announced that she listened carefully to all the witnesses, and none of them could confirm that the food she gave to the Emperor was anything like that. This led her to believe that it was Rudolph who poisoned the food on the way. The counselor noticed that Adele herself had given the food to the gentleman, and he took it to the Emperor. However, the girl said there is a witness who claims that the food could have been switched on the way. All the spectators in the court became excited when they heard that Bibi would testify, that the food could have been switched on the way. All the spectators in the court got excited when they heard that Bibi would testify. The Count became truly furious when he realized that his crime could be revealed. The judge noted that Miss Bibi had refused to make statements since she entered prison. Initially, the girl, I really didn't intend to testify for his own good after all. Even though it wasn't her fault, she was the one who served the glass of water to Her Majesty the Empress, therefore. The girl believed she'd had to atone for her guilt in front of the mistress. Then Adele noticed she was also preparing regular food, but Her Majesty was poisoned, so she was also guilty. The cook pointed out that this is a complete misunderstanding of how to atone for guilt. She realized that Bibi was only helping the real criminal escape, dry and out of the water with her silence. After these words, the girl got up and cornered herself, sinking back into a deep depression. Adele hoped that the effect of her words would be completely opposite, but she miscalculated. 3 days later, the girl came out of the corner and said she would declare to find the culprits. She hoped that through this, their names would be cleared and her reputation restored. The judge pointed out that the girl spent time in the same prison, so they could come to an agreement. Adele assured everyone that Bibi would never commit perjury for her. The girl announced that the witness would not testify in her case. She would tell you what happened 7 years ago before the Empress died. Then everyone would understand that whoever incriminated Bibi probably also incriminated Adele after these words. Count Saiton began to worry a lot because his involvement could be discovered after this announcement. The court asked the guards to call Bibi as a witness. The girl entered the courtroom and swore she would tell the truth, and nothing but the truth. After that, she said that 7 years ago she was Her Majesty the Empress's headmaid. It was a great honor for her to take care of a woman when she had a fever. The judge asked to get to the point, because there would be no one in this room who didn't know about this case. He himself was one of the judges who attended the meeting 7 years ago. Then Bibi refused to testify and was sent to prison without a trial. That's why now everyone was interested. In knowing why she changed her mind and decided to speak, Bibi admitted in this recap manhwa that she realized that with her silence, she was only helping the true killer of Her Majesty and not atoning for it. That's why now, even if it's very late, she would like to correct everything. The doctor said that even if the Empress had taken those medications, she would still have died. In the trial itself, the girl discovered that Her Majesty took all the prescribed medications except for the last dose. This is written in the report and everyone knows it except for Vivi herself. If the girl had demanded a trial at that time, then everything could have been completely different. After these words, the atmosphere in the hall changed. Even those who had just thrown mud at the girl began to sympathize with her. Now that everyone saw how worried Bibi was, people started to approach her. Then the girl admitted that she knew how it happened, that instead of medicines, she brought Her Majesty a glass of water every day. She went to the doctor's lab to get the medicine, then boiled it again, and only then took it to the Empress. It didn't take her more than 5 minutes, during which she kept her eyes on him, placed the medicine on a service cart, and took it away. The path from the lab to Her Majesty's chambers is long, and the palace halls are filled with servants and carts. It often happens that several carts can be found in the hallway at the same time. Somehow someone switched the carts. The hallway is quite narrow, so sometimes you have to wait for a larger cart to pass. Of course you have to be careful, but unfortunately, that day the girl was very alarmed by the state of Her Majesty, so she was in a hurry and didn't notice the cart that crashed directly into her at that moment. The girl fell after the collision and lost sight of the cart for a while. After that, she immediately jumped, grabbed the nearest cart, and kept running. Bibi didn't even think about the fact that the carts might have switched places. At that moment, Adele entered the conversation and addressed Rudolph. He wondered if the man had encountered someone in the hallway on the day of the poisoning. Then the servant thought about it and said that he had indeed collided with another cart that day in a narrow hallway. The judges were furious because the man hadn't mentioned this before. However, Rudolph admitted that he couldn't even think this had anything to do with the poisoning. But the man remembered very well that day he met the youngest son of Earl Seaton. After this, everyone immediately began to think that the father was protecting his son from punishment. The count started shouting that it was all a slander. While Adele watched from the sidelines, the girl turned her head and saw that Bibi was also enjoying this performance. Even the judge quickly addressed this issue and also followed the events with pleasure. Rudolph noticed he hadn't talked about anything, except that he bumped into his son in the hallway. After this, the count calmed down a bit and admitted that his son was quite stupid. Adele hoped her father wouldn't dare to pay her son once more. Adele's younger brother Lambert was 6 years younger than her. Unlike his daughter, who was just a tool, the count didn't adore the son he had been waiting for so long. The boy received excellent education, and many hopes were placed on him. However, he clearly wasn't shining with intelligence, and was a person with a very weak will. No one had told him anything yet but the young master. And she was a person with a very weak will. No one had said anything to her yet, but the young master immediately admitted his misconduct. The only thing this boy excelled at was fencing, but he constantly disappointed his parents in everything else. Even the count understood that his son should have denied all accusations immediately. Now, Adele realized the bad luck this man had because both of his sons turned out to be complete idiots. Lambert, shaking like a leaf, confessed everything during the trial, explaining in detail how he committed the crime, although it could have easily been attributed to someone else. The guy quickly admitted he was trying to force His Majesty to eat spoiled food. Lambert admitted he was just jealous of his older sister. She's so useless. And his sister reached such heights by becoming the emperor's cook that he couldn't contain himself. It was a very quick hearing, so the girl was easily declared innocent. Adele didn't understand at all why her younger brother, the count, was jealous of an ordinary cook. He relied on their dad and hoped this would damage the family's reputation greatly. After her release, Bibi promised that she would submit a report for her own release. Adele was glad that at least her new friend was free. However, the next problem was that the girl had no money to get home. It was at that very moment that Adele was called by the young prince. Kyle congratulated the girl on her victory and offered to take her home. The man admitted he had no doubt about the girl's innocence. He just didn't want her to spend a single minute in prison. However, Adele convinced him that she wasn't doing so bad in the cell thanks to His Majesty's care. It was quite bearable to be in prison at the end of the trip. The girl thanked the prince for his help because she didn't even have money for the carriage, however. The prince assured Adele that he had taken care of everything beforehand just at that moment. One of the maids approached the cook and told her that the emperor would call for her immediately. The girl said goodbye to the prince and ran to meet His Majesty. She sincerely believed that if the emperor had diligently protected her, things wouldn't have gotten this far. Her trial had just finished. She was tired, and he called her again directly to his office. Adele entered the emperor's room and didn't expect to see other guests there. The man apologized for bothering the girl at such a late hour, but he needed her presence. He was sure that the Count and his son would guess why the Emperor had called them. The man immediately admitted that his only flaw was not taking care of his son. The Count admitted that his son was very stupid, so he asked him to forgive him, however. The Emperor pointed out that Adele would decide what to do next with the boy. The Count was in complete shock and feared that the girl wouldn't be able to make a fair decision. However, the Emperor realized that of the two children of the Count, the only one doing anything was Lambert, so he was sure the girl wouldn't ask for something impossible. Adele felt this was her chance to get back at her father and reach a position the cook pointed out that she didn't need. No punishment for his family. The month in prison went pretty well, but the young Count had already suffered enough, though. The father understood that the girl couldn't leave it like that. There had to be some kind of trap. Instead, Adele announced she wanted compensation. The Emperor was surprised that the girl wanted money, but he considered it acceptable. Adele declared this would be a symbol of apology and goodwill from the Count, so the amount didn't matter. The father suggested this meant the girl herself should indicate the amount. Therefore, Adele came up with a clever plan and said she wrote down the minimum amount that suited her. The Count should also have an idea of how much he was willing to pay in compensation. Therefore, Adele would name a specific number. If it matched or was higher than his, then they would make a deal. However, if the amount was lower, then no compensation was needed and her brother would appear before the court. The Emperor noticed that his cook was a very clever girl. Adele said she would have to name the maximum amount that in her opinion they deserved. It had to be so large that her whole family was completely ruined. The girl would be very happy if she received all her father's fortune. It was a game of choice: take every last coin or send the young Count to court. To be honest, the girl would have opted to pay a compensation amount higher than the minimum limit. It was obvious the Count didn't want to send his beloved son to prison, but he had already confessed everything in front of numerous witnesses. Therefore, if they sent him to court, the guy wouldn't be released anytime soon. Thus, the Count had no choice but to pay the girl with money. Judging by the prince's words, prisons in this world are terrible. The girl was just lucky. Besides, she managed to befriend her matron and had a pretty good time. The Count agreed that if the amount exceeded what was written on the paper, nothing would threaten his son. Adele immediately confirmed this assumption and offered to indicate the required amount before the girl had time to finish speaking. The Count immediately announced he was offering 100.00000 in penta. This amount was so large that the girl couldn't even imagine it. There was so much money. Even the Emperor himself was surprised. He didn't believe the Count could think his daughter would demand such a large sum. However, the man was sure that the girl was a true hell demon and would take everything down to the last cent. But the Emperor trusted Adele and believed she was asking for much less. His Majesty was right. The Emperor trusted Adele and believed she asked for much less. Her Majesty was right, because the girl only wanted 100.000 pints as compensation. Upon hearing this, the Count was horrified and realized how wrong he was in his judgment. However, after what happened in front of the Emperor, the Count couldn't retract his words. Therefore, the ruler declared that if the man didn't pay this money to his daughter, he would consider it a personal challenge to the Emperor. The Count had no choice but to accept these conditions after this. Sidon and his son left, and the Emperor wanted to talk to his personal chef. First, he decided to praise the girl for how perfectly she handled this situation. He realized that Adele was not only very merciful, but also not greedy for money. In fact, the girl had this from the moment she demanded compensation. It was just a show, because no matter how much he wrote there, the outcome was already decided. All this idea with the note was just for the Emperor's sake, and not for the money. It was necessary to perfectly choose the amount so that the man wouldn't consider her greedy, but at the same time wouldn't sell her short. The only thing that could interfere with his plan would be if her father said the amount was too small. However, he couldn't do that because it was at stake, the life of his only son. The man realized he had spent a lot of money, but at least his beloved son was free. Adele enjoyed taking advantage of her father's unlimited love, which cost him a whopping $100,000. A snow-white bird soared into the sky, symbolizing purity and innocence. It flew near our heroine's house and accidentally dropped its feather there. Adele woke up for the first time in a long time, completely asleep and rested. A new free day arrived, which meant the girl could visit her favorite kitchen. However, after a while, she arrived at the palace and was very surprised. Her favorite cutlery that should have been there was not on the table. In one corner of the room, there were no bags of food she had left there. Everything that Adele treasured had disappeared without a trace. During her absence, the girl was glad that at least her beloved little fox Mars was in his place. However, she didn't understand what had happened. Had she been fired while she was in prison? The girl assumed they just made space, because there were many kitchens. Adele walked down the hallway when she suddenly smelled an incredibly attractive scent. The girl assumed it came from where the kitchen was now, so Adele headed in that direction and carefully approached the closed door. The cook opened the door a little and looked inside to confirm her guesses. There she noticed that a large number of cooks were walking back and forth with food in hand. They were all commanded by Mario, who had previously been her assistant. Adele suggested that now all the palace cooks report to her from outside. The young man seemed very professional and clearly knew what he was doing. Adele was glad her friend was promoted because he really deserved it. However, then, she got a little annoyed, because that meant she had lost her assistant herself. Adele enjoyed working with him and had fun going out with him. However, the girl didn't want to interfere with the young man's professional advancement, so she decided to leave. At the last moment, Mario saw her through the open kitchen door. The young man called the girl by name loudly and ran towards her, grabbed the cook's hand and dragged her straight to the center of the new kitchen there. He caught the attention of all the remaining employees and announced that the founding chef had returned. Adele didn't understand why he was making such a fuss, because she didn't know anyone in that kitchen. However, all the young chefs were delighted to hear Mario's words. These people were incredibly happy that the girl had finally returned to the kitchen, and they were worried about her well-being. They begged the girl to help them deal with various picky guests, the chefs, hoped that Adele would return to her duties as a cook as soon as possible. The girl felt embarrassed by so much attention towards her and blushed deeply. Mario saw this and immediately shooed the cooks away so they wouldn't interfere with the girl's work. The boy apologized to his friend for not being able to attend the trial due to his tight schedule. He admitted that if he had left the food, it would have spoiled and the tools would have rusted for that. Adele thanked her former assistant for taking care of everything. Mario was very surprised to hear these words from the girl. Adele was sure that she was helping him temporarily, until he himself became a real chef. Before the guys had time to agree, the great Dragon King suddenly entered the kitchen. Mario wondered what a noble knight like him would have forgotten in this small kitchen. The dragon came to ensure that his personal chef was released safe and sound from captivity. The little fox Mars also hadn't seen his ancestor for a long time, so he was happy to meet him. The dragon ordered the girl to immediately pack her things and go to the kitchen. Adele was very happy to finally have her own kitchen in the palace. The dragon was curious to know when the girl planned to start working after her release. He assumed that Adele would want to start working that same day. However, the cook announced that she would like to take a short vacation of a week. Immediately after these words, the whole room was engulfed in starfire. The dragon really missed the girl's cooking, so he was angry because he would have to wait for her to come back again. Mario explained that during Adele's absence, he was cooking in this kitchen, the boy admitted. He also planned to rest a bit while the girl was in prison, but the royal chefs couldn't please the emperor. Therefore, Mario had to return to duty and command all the other cooks so they wouldn't die from stress. The dragon noticed that if it weren't for Bibi, he personally would have burst into the prison and taken the cook out of there. Mario was already tired of telling the king that without Adele, he had no chance of trying something new. But in this recap manhwa, he didn't listen. The dragon was glad that the boy was no longer afraid of him, but he didn't like having learned to gossip. However, Mario knew he would now have fewer reasons to gossip, because Adele had returned to the kitchen. The girl was glad that all her friends and acquaintances were waiting for her. This proved that she was in her place for a reason, and could continue to amaze everyone with her wonderful food.